Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow stroll through the bustling streets of ancient Rome. Not the postcard-perfect marble avenues you might imagine, but the real, gritty, everyday paths that millions of sandals shuffled across. Picture it, cobbled roads stretching endlessly, flanked by towering stone buildings, market stalls spilling with fresh produce, and fountains gushing with crisp water from distant mountains. But let's not get too enchanted. These streets were alive, crowded, and yes, absolutely filthy. You probably wouldn't survive a day walking through it without dodging something unpleasant. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all are listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step onto the cobblestones, feeling the uneven surface beneath your feet. The road is alive with sound. Street vendors shouting their wares, the clatter of carts trundling by, the sharp clip-clop of hooves on stone. But beneath all that, there's something else. A faint, almost constant sweeping sound. Broom bristles scratching against stone. Over and over. It's the noise of an empire fighting back the grime of its own existence. The Romans took street cleanliness seriously, surprisingly so for a civilization that also indulged in gladiator games and grand feasts. Keeping the streets clean wasn't just about avoiding the stench, though that was certainly a part of it. It was a statement of power and pride. A clean street was a Roman street. Anything less would be unworthy of the empire that ruled the known world. So, who handled this daily battle against filth? Enter the Scoparia, the street sweepers of Rome. Armed with long-handled brooms made of bundled reeds, they were tasked with the unending duty of sweeping dust, debris, and, yes, even animal droppings from the stone roads. This wasn't a glamorous job, but it was a necessary one. The Scoparii would begin their rounds before dawn, working through the early hours when the streets were quieter, hoping to get a handle on the mess before the throngs of people poured out for their daily routines. Their brooms would scrape against the stone, pushing aside dirt and litter, sometimes sweeping it directly into the gutters that lined each road. These gutters, unlike the modern kind you might see today, were open trenches designed to channel water and whatever else found its way in, down to the cloaca Maxima, the city's massive underground sewer system. We'll get to that beast of engineering soon enough, but here's the funny thing. For all the effort the Romans put into cleaning, the streets were still, well, let's say organic. If you were walking down a bustling Roman avenue, you'd have to watch your step carefully. Horse manure was a common sight, of course, but so were food scraps, broken pottery, and the occasional mystery puddle. Romans weren't exactly shy about tossing their waste out the window, often with just a shouted warning of garde low, a habit the French would charmingly continue many centuries later. Historians still argue whether the Scoparii were truly effective, or if their work was mostly for show. After all, keeping thousands of miles of stone streets spotless was a monumental task. But effective or not, the ritual of sweeping held symbolic weight. It was a mark of civilization, a contrast to the barbaric lands beyond Rome's borders, where streets were often just muddy paths. For Romans, even if the streets weren't always pristine, the effort to clean them showed discipline and order. One oddball fact that might surprise you: the sweepers weren't always just lowly laborers. In some cases, they were part of larger public workforces, managed by local officials, who reported directly to the city's administration. These guys weren't freelancers sweeping out of the kindness of their hearts. They were organized, almost militarized in their efforts to keep Rome's heart beating cleanly. In fact, there were times when special teams were deployed during significant public events, such as triumphal parades or major market days, to make sure everything sparkled for the occasion. But what happened when things got really messy? Heavy rains could turn Rome's stone streets into slick rivers of muck. Market days often left piles of rotting vegetables and animal entrails scattered like confetti. And during festivals, well, let's just say the Scoparii had their work cut out for them. In those cases, larger cleanup crews would be dispatched to deal with the aftermath. sometimes working well into the night to restore order before the sun rose again. Imagine being one of those sweepers, trundling along the stone paths with your broom, dawn just peeking over the rooftops. You watch as merchants set up their stalls, as soldiers march past on their way to the forum, as children chase each other, shrieking, across the cobbles, and always the sound of your broom scrape, scrape, scrape against the stone, pushing the dirt back, keeping the city just a little bit cleaner, a little bit more civilized. But sweeping was more than just a chore. It was a performance of civic pride. Romans believed that clean streets reflected the strength of their empire. In fact, laws required property owners to maintain the cleanliness of the pavement directly in front of their buildings. If you owned a shop or a home on a busy street, it was your duty to make sure the path outside was swept and clear. Fail to do so, and you might find yourself facing fines, or worse, the public shame of your neighbors pointing fingers and shaking their heads. And here's a quirky bit of trivia. During particularly dusty summers, water carriers would walk ahead of the scopariae, sprinkling the roads to keep the dust down and make sweeping more effective. Imagine that, a pair of workers moving down the street, one sloshing water from a heavy clay jug, the other brushing it all away in a synchronized dance of cleanliness. Not exactly glamorous, but certainly efficient. Historians still debate how effective this really was. Some argue that the daily sweeping was mostly symbolic, a gesture of Roman dominance over chaos. Others believe it genuinely helped keep the streets navigable and cleaner than those of many other ancient cities. What's not debatable, though, is the fact that this process was just the surface layer. Beneath Rome's streets lay something far more sophisticated, a network of underground sewers that whisked away the waste of 1 million souls. But that's a journey for the next step. For now, picture the bustling streets as they come to life in the early morning light. Scopari pushing their brooms with practiced rhythm, the scent of fresh bread mixing with the not-so-pleasant odor of animal stalls, and the distant hum of the city awakening. Next, we're diving underground, to the veins of the city, where the waste of an empire was carried away silently and efficiently. Let's explore the grand engineering of the Cloaca Maxima, a marvel that still flows beneath Rome to this very day. You take a deep breath and imagine descending down, beneath the bustling streets of Rome, past the cobblestones that have seen countless footsteps, and into the dark, damp veins of the city itself. There, hidden from the sunlight and the chaos above, lies one of the most impressive feats of Roman engineering, the Cloaca Maxima. Its name translates to Great Sewer, and that's exactly what it was. A vast underground system designed to whisk away the waste and filth of Rome. You might be thinking, a sewer. Impressive, but trust me, for its time, the Cloaca Maxima was nothing short of revolutionary. Built originally in the 6th century BCE, it started as an open-air canal intended to drain the marshlands between Rome's famous hills, particularly around the Forum. Over time, as the city expanded and the streets grew more congested, the Romans covered the canal, transforming it into a subterranean marvel of stone and brickwork. Picture it, enormous stone arches, stretching in perfect symmetry, their surfaces slick with centuries of water flow. The walls, layered with limestone and volcanic rock, were designed to endure not just the everyday grime of city life, but also the periodic flooding of the Tiber River. Engineers sloped the entire system just right, allowing gravity to do the work, sending waste downhill toward the river. No pumps, no electricity, just pure engineering brilliance. And it wasn't just sewage that flowed through those tunnels. Rainwater, street runoff. And yes, the results of all that sweeping from our friends the Scopari would end up in the same place. The open gutters that ran alongside the main streets connected directly to this vast sewer network, ensuring that Rome's mess wasn't just shuffled around. It was moved out entirely. The phrase "out of sight, out of mind" could have been invented by the Romans themselves. The Cloaca Maxima wasn't just practical. It was a symbol of Roman ingenuity. Other cities at the time, even great ones like Athens and Alexandria, struggled with drainage and sanitation, while Roman engineers were quietly channeling muck out of the city's heart. Other civilizations were still tossing waste into the streets. The difference? Less disease, less stench, and a far grander image of imperial majesty. The Romans understood that a clean city wasn't just about health, it was about pride. Of course, like anything in ancient Rome, the Cloaca Maxima had its quirks. There were stories, some whispered, some shouted in the chaotic marketplaces, about daring thieves using the sewer to sneak in and out of buildings. Imagine slipping through one of the street grates, climbing down into the damp darkness, and navigating the tunnels like a subterranean highway. Roman guards were even posted at certain key junctions to catch anyone foolish enough to try. Historians still debate whether these tales are fact or just dramatic embellishments, but there's enough evidence to suggest that at least some bandits made use of the sewers. After all, it was a way to travel unseen, slipping right beneath the noses and feet of Rome's ever-watchful eyes. The sewer also played a more civic role. When the city flooded, which was not uncommon, the Cloaca Maxima allowed much of the water to drain away swiftly, minimizing damage. During particularly heavy rains, you might have seen water gushing out of the grates that lined the streets, like miniature waterfalls spilling into the gutters, rushing away with remarkable efficiency. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of overflow and chaos, but for the time, it was a masterpiece. And get this, it's still operational today. That's right. A sewage system built over 2,000 years ago is still carrying rainwater out of Rome. If that isn't a testament to Roman craftsmanship, I don't know what is. Modern engineers have studied it, marveled at its design, and sometimes even imitated it. While Rome's empire may have crumbled, its sewer still flows steadily. A quiet, ancient current beneath the city's bustling streets. One of the most interesting aspects of the Cloaca Maxima is how it was integrated with Rome's larger water system. The Romans were obsessed with water, controlling it, moving it, and, perhaps most impressively, cleaning it. Aqueducts carried fresh water from distant hills straight into the city, feeding public baths, fountains, and even private homes. That water, once used, would then drain away, flowing through gutters and into the sewers, where it would be whisked away to the Tiber. It was a full cycle, like a primitive form of urban plumbing, stretching across miles of stonework. But here's a quirky tidbit. The Romans actually believed that certain spirits and gods watched over their sewers. The Cloaca Maxima itself was dedicated to the goddess Cloacina, who was thought to purify the city's waters. In fact, there was even a small shrine to her near the forum, where citizens would leave offerings for good fortune and clean water. I guess even the ancients knew you couldn't mess with plumbing and get away with it. Historians still argue whether the original builders of the Cloaca Maxima ever intended it to last this long, or if its durability was simply a happy accident of good design and robust materials. Some say it was intended to be a temporary solution to the swampy ground of early Rome, while others believe it was always meant to be a permanent artery for the city's waste. Whichever is true, the fact remains, it worked. And it worked well. Imagine the roar of water coursing through those ancient tunnels after a heavy rain, the echoes bouncing off stone walls carved millennia ago. The streets above, swept clean by the scoparii, drain their refuse down into the mighty sewer, where it joins the flow, heading out to the Tiber, out to the sea, a system of unseen order beneath the chaos of the city, a bit of engineering magic hidden in the muck. And while the Cloaca Maxima did its work in the shadows, the streets above remained the stage for Roman life, bustling with vendors, soldiers, and merchants. But the Romans weren't done there. They knew that clean streets and working sewers were just the start. To keep this grand city functioning, they had to take cleanliness even further, turning it into a civic duty, a legal obligation, and, in some cases, a point of public pride. Next, we'll climb back up to the surface and explore just how seriously Romans took their street cleanliness and the laws they put in place to keep it that way. Because in Rome, it wasn't just the Scoparii and the Cloaca Maxima keeping things tidy. The people themselves had their part to play. As you emerge from the shadowy depths of the Cloaca Maxima, the sunlight floods back in, and the hum of Roman life resumes. The streets are bustling once more. Merchants hawking their goods, chariots clattering along the stone pathways, and the occasional shout of a fruit vendor trying to outdo his neighbor. But amidst the chaos, there's an order to it all. You wouldn't think it just by looking. But Roman streets weren't left to chance. They were maintained by strict laws that ensured everyone played their part in keeping them clean. That's right, the ancient Romans weren't just sweeping the streets out of the goodness of their hearts. They were required to do it. By law, the Romans had a surprisingly modern sense of public order, and that extended right down to the cobblestones themselves. It all started with the Lex Julia Municipalis, a set of municipal laws laid down during the reign of Julius Caesar. Among its many provisions, it explicitly demanded that property owners were responsible for keeping the stretch of pavement in front of their homes and shops clean and free of debris. If you owned a bakery on a busy street corner, you couldn't just toss your flour sacks and broken pottery out the back and forget about it. No, sir, you were expected to sweep up, clear the gutters, and make sure that stretch of road was presentable. And it wasn't just about appearances. Dirty streets were a health hazard. Even by Roman standards, open gutters carried waste straight into the Cloaca Maxima, but they could only handle so much. Clogged drains meant flooded streets, and flooded streets meant diseases spreading like wildfire. The city's lawmakers weren't going to let that happen. Not on their watch. Fines could be issued for those who ignored their civic duties. And in more extreme cases, public shaming was in order. Imagine your neighbors shaking their heads, muttering insults in Latin as they stepped around the mess outside your door. Not exactly the way to earn respect in the forum. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The Romans had an early form of what you might call neighborhood watch for cleanliness. If someone was slacking on their duties, it wasn't just the city officials who would notice. Neighbors were quick to report those who neglected their responsibilities. It was part pride, part necessity. A clean street reflected well on everyone who lived there, and Romans, ever proud of their civilization, took that pretty seriously. Historians still argue whether this community enforcement was more effective than the city's own street inspectors, known as aediles. These officials weren't just busybodies with clipboards. They were high-ranking magistrates, tasked with maintaining public order. Their responsibilities included everything from organizing public games to inspecting marketplaces, and yes, ensuring the streets stayed clean. If you thought your neighborhood HOA was strict, just imagine having a Roman aedile strolling by your property with the power to issue fines and penalties on the spot. The aediles didn't just manage the streets. They also oversaw the street markets, which were notorious for getting messy. Picture the aftermath of a busy day. Fish guts, crushed grapes, olive pits, and animal droppings littering the pathways. Market vendors were required to clean up their stalls and ensure the waste was removed properly, often with the help of Scoparii. Failure to do so could result in steep fines, or worse, the wrath of a well-connected aedile who wanted to make an example out of you. But it wasn't all punishment and discipline. Romans knew the value of incentives. 2. In some neighborhoods, wealthy patrons would sponsor cleanup projects, paying out of pocket to have streets swept and waste collected. It was partly a charitable act, but let's be real, it was mostly about status. Nothing said I'm a big deal in Rome, like a sparkling clean street outside your villa. Courtesy of your own private crew of sweepers, it was common to see plaques installed, engraved with the names of benefactors who paid for public works, including street cleaning. You'd walk past those inscriptions and know exactly who had the money and the power to keep their part of Rome spotless. And speaking of wealth and power, there's a quirky bit of Roman ingenuity you might not expect. Pavement design. Wealthy homeowners sometimes paid extra for their sidewalks to be designed with small, gentle slopes, making it easier for rainwater to wash away debris. They even commissioned elaborate mosaics and decorative stones that were easier to sweep. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about practicality. Why spend hours with a broom when gravity could do half the work for you? Now, I know what you're thinking. With all this organization, did Rome actually manage to keep its streets clean? The answer is, sort of. By ancient standards, yes, Rome's streets were remarkably well maintained. Compared to other cities of its size and scale, Roman roads were less cluttered and more navigable. But perfect? Hardly. For every well-maintained block, there were still cramped alleys where waste piled up, where the Scopari's brooms rarely reached, and where gutters overflowed during the rainy season. Historians still debate how consistent the enforcement of these cleanliness laws truly was. Some believe the main avenues and marketplaces were prioritized, while the back streets of poorer districts were left to fend for themselves. Others argue that even the poorest neighborhoods saw regular cleanup, thanks to the communal pride instilled by Roman culture. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Just like in any major city, resources were unevenly distributed, and the wealthier districts got the lion's share of attention. But whatever the reality, the sheer fact that Rome tried, that it enforced street sweeping laws, maintained public sewers, and kept the streets somewhat passable, is a testament to its organizational power. And it wasn't just a reflection of civic pride. It was a demonstration of control. Clean streets sent a message. Rome wasn't just any city. It was the center of the known world. And it wouldn't be caught dead wallowing in its own mess. And while the Scoparii swept, the aediles patrolled, and the wealthy financed cleaner pavements, Rome's waste found its way into the sewers below, carried off by the mighty Cloaca Maxima, spilling eventually into the Tiber. But even that wasn't enough. For a city of 1 million people, you couldn't just rely on a few street sweepers and some public ordinances. Rome needed a grander plan for its waste, a way to control the flow of filth and manage the constant flood of garbage. Next, we'll explore just how Rome handled that tidal wave of refuse, from household scraps to industrial waste. It wasn't always pretty, but it was nothing short of remarkable. Get ready to dig through the remnants of everyday life in ancient Rome. As you step back onto the bustling streets of Rome, the sun hangs high above, casting long shadows from the towering stone buildings and bustling market stalls. The air is thick with the scent of fresh bread mingling with the less pleasant odors of livestock and yesterday's trash. You can hear the faint rush of water beneath your feet, the soft whisper of the Cloaca Maxima, still working tirelessly to carry away the city's waste. But not everything in Rome flowed conveniently underground. Much of it remained right there, out in the open, and it had to be dealt with. Rome was a city of grandiosity, of epic scale, and that applied not just to its monuments, but also to its waste. Now, imagine for a moment a city of nearly 1 million people, all cooking, eating, selling, and throwing things away. The markets alone were a chaotic storm of food scraps, broken pottery, and discarded cloth. Fishmongers would leave behind piles of scales and guts. Butchers scattered bones and sinew, and vegetable stalls left heaps of wilted leaves and crushed fruit in their wake. And all that mess, it couldn't just be left there. While the Scoparii swept the streets, the bulkier waste required a more elaborate system. Enter the Roman Urban Waste Management Network, a surprisingly organized structure for a city of its size and age. First, there were designated collection points around the city, known as puticuli. These were essentially large pits, dug specifically to collect refuse. They were strategically placed at the edges of busy markets and near public gathering spots, so merchants and citizens alike could dump their trash before it became a problem. These pits were a sight to behold, not necessarily a pleasant one, but impressive in their capacity. Every day, refuse collectors known as stercorarii would make their rounds, hauling carts piled with waste from the city center to these dump sites. The stercorarii weren't exactly held in high esteem. Their work was filthy and grueling, and yet it was absolutely essential. Without them, the streets of Rome would have overflowed with waste in a matter of days. But the waste didn't just pile up and rot. The Romans, ever resourceful, found ways to put even their trash to good use. much of the organic waste, vegetable scraps, animal entrails, and other biodegradable matter was transported to the countryside and used as fertilizer for farms. It was a system of recycling that kept the farms fertile and the city streets a little less clogged with refuse. And as for the non-organic waste, pottery shards were often repurposed as cheap building material for poorer neighborhoods, while metals and glass were melted down and reused. Historians still argue whether this system was as effective as the Romans believed. Some say that the collection pits were often neglected, left to overflow until the smell became unbearable. Others insist that Rome's ability to maintain a city of its size with relatively clean streets is proof enough that the system worked. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle, as it often does. One of the more unusual aspects of Roman waste management was their attitude towards human waste. In addition to the massive sewer system, the Romans constructed public latrines, which were an innovation in both hygiene and social interaction. These weren't tiny, secluded stalls tucked away from view. No, these were long, open benches with holes cut out, placed side by side, with nothing but a bit of open space between you and the next user. Privacy wasn't exactly a top priority. Imagine sitting there, making awkward small talk with your neighbor, while streams of water ran continuously beneath the seats, washing everything away. Now here's the quirky part. Romans didn't use toilet paper. Instead, they used a tool called a tersorium, which was essentially a sponge on a stick. The sponge was dipped in water, sometimes even vinegar for extra cleanliness, and then used. When finished, it was rinsed off in the same communal water trough and left for the next person. A bit of shared hygiene, Roman style. Historians still debate whether this method actually kept things sanitary, but given the scale of Roman public health, it must have worked at least well enough. But what about household waste? For the average Roman family, waste disposal was a mix of civic duty and, frankly, convenience. Small items were often tossed right out the window, hence the Roman shout of "Garde l'eau" as a warning to passers-by below. Larger refuse was carried to the puticuli or left for the stercorarii to collect. If you were wealthy, you might have had servants to handle the dirty work for you, ensuring your marble-paved doorstep remained spotless. On particularly busy market days, or after festivals, the volume of waste would skyrocket. The stercorari would have to work overtime, hauling load after load out of the city. And remember, this wasn't modern trash. There were no plastic wrappers or aluminum cans. We're talking piles of rotting vegetables, animal bones, broken clay jars, and shredded linen. The streets would be swept, the larger debris carted away, and the gutters flushed with water from the city's aqueducts to clear out any lingering muck. One fascinating discovery from excavations in Rome is the layers of waste that built up over centuries. Archaeologists have found entire hills formed from the discarded remnants of ancient Roman life, pottery fragments, bones, even bits of jewelry that somehow found their way into the refuse piles. In a way, these heaps of garbage are a kind of time capsule, preserving the everyday lives of Romans in a way that marble statues and grand villas never could. Historians still debate the effectiveness of Rome's waste management system, especially in the poorer districts where stercorarii were less frequent visitors. Some argue that these neighborhoods were often left to fend for themselves, with trash piling up in alleyways and side streets. Others claim that community pride kept even the rougher parts of Rome relatively tidy. What's clear is that Rome, for all its grandeur, struggled with the same issues of waste and cleanliness that modern cities do today. And yet, despite these challenges, the streets remained navigable, the markets stayed bustling, and the city thrived. Waste was managed, not always perfectly, but with a remarkable level of organization for its time. Rome may have been gritty and grimy in places, but it worked. And for a city of its size and age, that alone is impressive. Next, we'll explore how Rome's obsession with cleanliness extended beyond mere sweeping and waste disposal, and into the very concept of public welfare. Because for the Romans, clean streets weren't just practical. They were a matter of civic pride, and public responsibility. The sun is dipping low over the jagged rooftops of Rome, casting long shadows over the bustling markets and narrow alleyways. The smell of roasting meat mingles with the sharp tang of fresh herbs, and the clatter of wooden carts echoes through the stone-lined streets. You weave through the crowds, sidestepping puddles and piles of refuse, marveling at how this sprawling empire kept its streets not just clear of debris, but actively clean. By law and by custom, it wasn't just about brooms and sewers. The Romans had something far more powerful, a collective sense of responsibility that tied street cleanliness to community pride. They called it cura annonae, a term that roughly translates to the care and provisioning of the people. On the surface, it was about ensuring grain supplies and public markets, but it extended deeply into sanitation and public health. The logic was simple. A clean city was a healthy city, and a healthy city was a strong city. At the heart of this concept was the belief that every Roman citizen, regardless of status, had a role to play in maintaining the city's order. Shop owners swept their storefronts, householders scrubbed the stones outside their doors, and vendors kept their stalls clear of rotting produce and discarded fish bones. This wasn't merely a matter of convenience, it was a legal obligation. The Lex Julia Municipalis, the same law that mandated sidewalk maintenance, also dictated that refuse could not be left out in the open. If you failed to keep your stretch of the road clean, you weren't just being a bad neighbor. You were breaking the law. Historians still debate how consistently these laws were enforced. Some suggest that in wealthier districts, city officials and aediles kept a closer watch, while the poorer neighborhoods were left to their own devices. Others argue that community pride and mutual accountability ensured that even the more modest streets stayed relatively clean. Either way, the expectation was clear. Your street was your responsibility, and you had better keep it that way. This sense of civic duty extended beyond mere sweeping. During public festivals and state celebrations, the streets of Rome were transformed into bustling avenues of revelry. Confetti, garlands, and even flower petals would be scattered along parade routes, only to be meticulously cleaned up afterward. For the Romans, the aftermath of celebration was almost as important as the event itself. Nobody wanted to wake up the morning after a triumphal procession to the sight of wilted flowers and soggy parchment clogging the gutters. Scopari crews were dispatched in greater numbers, sweeping the cobblestones clean, as if the festivities had never even happened. The Roman government didn't leave everything to chance. Though public sanitation projects were funded as part of broader civic responsibilities, wealthy patrons would sometimes sponsor street cleaning projects as a form of public goodwill, or, more cynically, as a way to curry favor with the masses. It wasn't uncommon to see plaques mounted on public fountains or street corners, proudly displaying the name of the benefactor who had funded the latest round of repairs or renovations. It was like ancient Rome's version of a sponsored by banner, except with a bit more marble and a lot more ego. But there was more to Rome's cleanliness than just civic pride and good public relations. The city was engineered, almost obsessively, for drainage and waste removal. Streets were paved with large stone slabs, angled ever so slightly to allow rainwater to run off into the gutters. Those gutters, in turn, fed directly into the sewer system or into nearby rivers, flushing out refuse and grime before it could build up. It was a masterpiece of urban planning, one that wouldn't be rivaled in Europe for another 1,000 years. Now, you might be wondering, what happened when things got really messy? Let's say a thunderstorm rolled through, turning the stone streets into slippery rivers of mud and debris. Or perhaps the markets got particularly wild, with fishmongers dumping entrails and butchers casting off their offcuts. In those cases, the Romans called in their heavy hitters, the curatores viarum. These were officials specifically appointed to oversee the maintenance and cleanliness of Rome's major roadways. Think of them as the city's first road commissioners. They coordinated repairs, arranged for debris removal, and ensured that markets and public gatherings didn't leave the streets in chaos. They also handled disputes about property boundaries, and ensured that public fountains, critical for rinsing and drinking, remained accessible and clean. One curious tradition tied to these officials was the purification rituals performed periodically to cleanse the streets spiritually as well as physically. During major festivals or times of crisis, priests would walk the major avenues, sprinkling water and offering prayers for the city's well-being. These ceremonies weren't just symbolic. They were deeply tied to the belief that cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene, it was about moral order. A filthy street was seen as a reflection of a decaying society, while a clean, well-maintained avenue spoke of strength and virtue. Historians still argue whether these purification rituals had any real impact on cleanliness, or if they were merely symbolic gestures meant to reassure the public. After all, Rome's streets, despite all the effort, were never spotless. There were still alleys clogged with mud after a heavy rain, and back streets where refuse lingered longer than it should have. But the point was that Rome tried. It had the infrastructure, the laws, and the civic pride to keep the worst of it at bay. The quirkiest aspects of this public responsibility was the role of guilds and trade associations. Different trades were responsible for their own mess. Bakers swept flour off their cobblestones, fishmongers washed away scales and guts, and olive vendors carted off their bruised and unwanted fruit. These guilds would sometimes pool their resources to pay for larger street cleaning efforts, particularly after major market days. It wasn't charity, it was survival. A clean market was a profitable market, and when all else failed, Rome had one last trick up its sleeve: fines. Aediles and curatores viarum had the authority to levy fines on property owners who neglected their duties. These fines weren't just a slap on the wrist. They could be significant enough to make even the wealthiest merchant think twice about leaving his trash out overnight. In this way, the Romans managed to keep their streets at least passably clean, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. Imagine it: the sun setting over the 7 hills, the last of the vendors sweeping away the remnants of their wares, scopari pushing their brooms in rhythmic sweeps, and the faint gurgle of water draining through the gutters into the great cloaca maxima below. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. For a city of 1 million souls, it worked remarkably well. Next, we'll wander deeper into Rome's intricate water systems, those majestic aqueducts that not only brought fresh water to the city, but also played a crucial role in keeping the streets clean. After all, what good is sweeping if you can't wash away the dust? The sound of rushing water greets you as you move away from the bustling markets and winding alleys of Rome. It's a soft, constant murmur that rises and falls with the wind, echoing off stone walls and flowing beneath your feet through hidden channels. You follow it, stepping carefully over cobblestones, still damp from the morning's street washing, until you arrive at the source. The great aqueducts of Rome, towering marvels of engineering that stretched across miles of countryside to bring fresh, clean water into the heart of the city. If the Cloaca Maxima was Rome's underground lifeblood, the aqueducts were its veins, pumping life into the metropolis day after day. They were colossal stone structures, arches stacked upon arches, sometimes reaching stories high, all to maintain the perfect angle of descent. Not too steep, not too shallow, just enough for gravity to pull the water gently downhill from mountain springs and rivers. To walk beneath one of these aqueducts was to feel dwarfed by Rome's ambition. Massive stones, precisely cut and mortared with techniques still marveled at today, allowed water to flow uninterrupted for miles. The most famous of these was the Aqua Claudia, stretching nearly 50 miles, from its source in the hills outside the city to its terminus within Rome's borders. It wasn't just a feat of engineering. It was a declaration of power. No other city in the world at that time could boast such mastery over water. And water was life. It wasn't just for drinking, though that was certainly important. The aqueducts supplied public fountains, which dotted nearly every corner of the city. Some were simple spouts that poured continuously into stone basins, while others were ornate, decorated with marble sculptures and inscriptions dedicated to the emperors who commissioned them. These fountains weren't just decorative. They were essential. Romans collected water here for cooking, bathing, and yes, for cleaning the ever-dusty streets. But the aqueducts had another purpose. One you might not expect. They were crucial for flushing the streets clean. That's right. The constant flow of fresh water allowed for the regular washing of public pathways. City officials would periodically release water through carefully designed grates, sending it coursing through the gutters, sweeping away the grime and muck of everyday life. Vendors would watch as yesterday's spilled wine and bits of fruit rind were whisked away, replaced with the smooth sheen of wet cobblestones. Historians still debate how often these flushes occurred. Some believe it was a daily ritual in the busier markets and main roads, while others argue it was reserved for special occasions or particularly filthy stretches of street. Either way, the aqueducts made it possible, turning the very flow of water into a tool of sanitation. And it wasn't just the major roads that benefited. The smaller, winding alleys, the kind you'd imagine sneaking through with a hood drawn low, had their own modest drains and runoff systems. Even here, water would trickle through stone channels, carrying away the dust and debris of daily life. Of course, it wasn't perfect. In the poorer neighborhoods, the water didn't always reach as frequently, and the gutters would sometimes back up, leaving the streets a bit more treacherous. But the fact that it reached at all speaks to Rome's obsession with order. There's a quirky bit of history tied to this obsession. Water inspectors, known as curatores aquarum, their job to ensure that every drop of water coming into the city was accounted for and properly distributed. They patrolled the aqueducts, checked for leaks, and monitored the fountains. Any unauthorized tapping of the water lines was a serious offense. After all, water in Rome wasn't just a luxury, it was state-controlled. Theft of water was seen as theft from the empire itself, and theft did happen. There are stories of wealthy villa owners bribing workers to reroute aqueduct lines just a few inches, enough to divert a trickle of fresh water into their private courtyards. Some even constructed elaborate underground channels to tap into the main lines without detection. Historians still argue whether these tales are exaggerated, but Roman records do document several cases of fines and even imprisonment for illegal water use. Imagine going to jail for stealing water, yet in Rome, it was a real risk. Of course, the aqueducts didn't just power fountains and flush streets. They also fed the public baths, which were as much a social hub as they were a place of cleanliness. Picture it. Massive stone complexes, steam rising from heated pools, the laughter and shouts of citizens echoing off marble walls. Men and women of all classes would visit the baths not just to clean themselves, but to meet friends, conduct business, and even engage in a bit of gossip. The water for these baths flowed directly from the aqueducts, filtered and channeled with stunning precision. One of the grandest of these was the Baths of Caracalla, an immense complex that could accommodate up to 600 people at a time. Its floors were laid with intricate mosaics, its walls lined with towering columns, and its pools fed by a constant stream of aqueduct water. For the average Roman, a visit to the baths wasn't just routine. It was a ritual of purification, a way to wash away the grime of the streets and emerge refreshed. And when the water left the baths, it didn't just vanish. In classic Roman efficiency, it was channeled back out into the streets, helping to flush the gutters and keep the roadways clean. Waste not. Want not. Even the dirty water from public baths found its way into the city's sanitation system, serving one last purpose before being drained away into the depths of the Cloaca Maxima. Historians still marvel at how effective this system truly was. For a city of nearly 1 million people, The constant cycling of fresh water from the mountains to the streets, from the fountains to the sewers, kept Rome cleaner and healthier than most cities would be for another 1,000 years. It wasn't perfect. Of course, during times of drought, the aqueducts would slow and the gutters would clog, but the fact that it worked at all is a testament to Roman ingenuity. Imagine it, standing on a bustling street corner, watching the water trickle down from a public fountain, flowing smoothly through stone channels, washing away the dust of the day. Merchants splash their carts clean, children playfully kick the puddles, and the city seems to breathe just a little easier. The streets may not have sparkled, but they were alive with the constant pulse of water, flowing just as it had for centuries, binding the city together, stone by stone. Next, we'll explore what happened to the debris that didn't wash away, the clutter of everyday life that couldn't be swept into the gutters or flushed through the sewers. Where did all that garbage go? Let's take a look at Rome's sprawling garbage dumps and landfills, and the surprising ways the Romans dealt with their everyday refuse. As you follow the flow of water through the streets of Rome, past the fountains and down the gently sloped gutters, you begin to notice something peculiar. Despite all the sweeping, the flushing, and the constant patrols of the scopari, not everything disappears. Bits of broken pottery, scraps of leather, discarded sandals, and piles of rotting vegetable leaves seem to collect in corners, stubbornly resisting the city's best efforts at cleanliness. You might wonder, where did all of Rome's garbage actually go? For a city of nearly 1 million people, the answer wasn't always simple. Romans, like any urban population, generated mountains of waste, discarded amphorae, broken tiles, shattered glass, scraps of fabric, bones, and every kind of food scrap imaginable cluttered the streets and markets every day. While some of it was swept into the gutters and carried away by the mighty Cloaca Maxima, much of it was carted off to Rome's version of landfills, puticuli, and urban dumping grounds. Puticuli were large pits dug specifically for waste disposal. These weren't modest trash heaps. Mind you, some of these pits were massive, capable of holding tons of waste at a time. Located at the edges of the city or in abandoned quarries, these dumping sites served as the final resting place for Rome's everyday refuse. Stercorari, the city's waste collectors, would load up their carts each morning, trundling through the narrow streets to gather up whatever had been left behind or thrown out. They would then make their way to these dumps, tipping their loads into the gaping pits where it would fester and decay. The puticuli weren't just for household waste. Animal carcasses from butchers, broken pottery from market stalls, and even spoiled goods from the docks were all thrown in. Over time, these pits filled and were covered over, sometimes reused and sometimes simply left to rot. Archaeologists have discovered layers upon layers of Roman trash, preserved like sediment, a time capsule of everyday life in the empire. Broken dishes, shattered wine jugs, and even personal belongings like combs and brooches have been unearthed, revealing the small details of Roman life that history books often overlook. But the most infamous of these dumping grounds was Monte Testaccio, Rome's artificial hill made entirely of discarded pottery, mostly amphorae, stretching 35 meters high and covering an area of about 20,000 square meters. Monte Testaccio is essentially a mountain of trash. The pottery shards are so densely packed that the hill still stands to this day, a monument to Rome's ancient appetite for olive oil. You see, the amphora used to transport olive oil were not reused like other vessels. Once emptied, the porous clay absorbed enough of the oil that it would go rancid, making them useless. So, the Romans tossed them out. Millions of them, layer upon layer, year after year, until a literal mountain was formed. Historians still debate how organized the dumping process at Monte Testaccio actually was. Some believe that Roman waste collectors meticulously stacked the amphorae to maximize space, while others argue that the hill grew organically, with pots simply dumped wherever there was room. What's undeniable is that Monte Testaccio was not just a landfill. It was a kind of archive. Labels stamped on the amphorae reveal the origin of the olive oil, who shipped it, and sometimes even the date it was produced. Modern archaeologists have been able to map trade routes and understand economic patterns just by studying this mountain of broken pottery. But not everything was tossed away. The Romans were surprisingly thrifty when it came to repurposing materials. Broken pottery shards, known as ostraka, were often reused as writing tablets. You'd find merchants scribbling quick notes or tallying up accounts on fragments of discarded pots. It was cheap, durable, and plentiful. Even chunks of marble or old stone from demolished buildings were frequently salvaged and repurposed in construction. In fact, if you were to walk through Rome during its height, you'd likely see bits of older temples or statues embedded in the walls of newer buildings, an ancient form of recycling. One of the most intriguing aspects of Roman waste disposal was their handling of organic refuse. Unlike the ceramic shards and iron scraps that littered Monte Testaccio, food waste and animal remnants were collected more carefully. Farmers from the outskirts of Rome would sometimes pay for the right to cart away piles of organic waste to use as fertilizer for their fields. This cycle of waste, collected in the city, transported to the countryside, and then returned in the form of fresh produce, was an early glimpse of sustainable agriculture. It kept the soil fertile and the streets a little less cluttered. Historians still argue whether this agricultural recycling was officially organized by the city or if it was simply a practical solution adopted by farmers. Some believe there were contracts and official schedules, while others suggest it was more informal, a kind of mutual understanding between city dwellers and those who tilled the land. Either way, it worked. The trash of Rome helped feed its people in a roundabout but effective way. But of course, not everything was so neatly repurposed. Some waste was simply too hazardous or too disgusting to be left in the open, or repurposed for agriculture. This included materials like ash from smithies, offcuts from tanneries, and the remains of sacrificial animals from temple rituals. These materials were carted off to even more remote dumping grounds, often outside the city limits. In some cases, the ashes from ironworks and glass blowing were actually used to pave roads, giving Roman cobblestones their distinctive, gritty texture. One quirky detail: the Romans even had an early form of street-sweeping taxes. Local merchants in the busiest market districts would pool their resources to pay for additional stercorarii to collect refuse more frequently. It wasn't exactly voluntary. It was more of an understanding enforced by aediles. Fail to contribute, and your stall might be mysteriously skipped during the next round of cleaning. It was a rough system, but it kept the chaos of the markets under control. Imagine walking through Monte Testaccio today, the shards of amphorae crunching beneath your feet, stretching out in every direction, each fragment a whisper from the past. An olive oil shipment from Spain, a cargo manifest from Carthage, a merchant's name stamped proudly on the rim. It's not the grand marble of the Forum or the towering arches of the aqueducts, but it's no less a testament to Rome's staggering scale. Even its garbage was monumental. Next, we'll explore how Romans found ways to recycle and repurpose even more of their waste, and how their innovations in this area helped the city function more smoothly, and sometimes even profitably. As you leave behind the towering mounds of Monte Testaccio, the shards of pottery still crunching beneath your feet, you wander back into the bustling heart of Rome. The markets are alive with voices, vendors shouting prices for olives and figs, the clatter of ironworks, the braying of donkeys pulling wooden carts piled high with goods. Amidst all this chaos, it's hard to imagine that anything here was ever thrown away. But in Rome, even waste found its way back into the cycle of everyday life. The Romans were masters of recycling and repurposing, long before it became a modern virtue. The city's sheer size and the constant churn of materials demanded it. Pottery shards weren't just swept away and forgotten. They were repurposed as building material, used to fill foundations and stabilize roads. If you strolled through the back streets of Rome, you might even spot bits of broken amphorae peeking out from crumbling walls, evidence of Roman ingenuity. One of the most fascinating examples of Roman recycling was their use of ostraka, fragments of broken pottery that served as makeshift notepads. In a time before paper was common, these shards were invaluable for jotting down quick notes, recording debts, or even casting votes in local assemblies. You can almost imagine a Roman shopkeeper scribbling down an order for olive oil on a chipped piece of clay, tucking it into his tunic before heading off to the market. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Glass, too, found new life in Rome. Unlike pottery, glass could be melted down and reshaped, making it one of the most recyclable materials of the time. When glass containers broke, they weren't just tossed aside. They were collected, taken to workshops, and remelted into fresh bottles or decorative objects. Some glassworkers became quite skilled at reshaping broken pieces into intricate designs, even crafting tiny glass beads that would be strung into jewelry or sewn into garments. It's a testament to Roman resourcefulness. They wasted very little of what they created. But it wasn't just about practicality. It was also about economy. Recycling materials reduced costs for craftsmen and merchants. Glassblowers, for example, would often collect discarded glass from the streets and rework it, saving on raw materials. Blacksmiths would melt down old iron tools and scrap metal to forge new weapons and plows. Even stone was repurposed. When old temples or public buildings were dismantled, their blocks weren't abandoned. They were reused in new constructions, their inscriptions sometimes still visible if you looked closely enough. Historians still debate how systematic this recycling effort truly was. Some believe it was largely left up to individual trades and craftsmen, while others argue that the city itself maintained a sort of unofficial network of collectors and recyclers. What's certain is that Rome's streets were dotted with workshops that thrived on these discarded materials. The clang of hammer on iron, the hiss of glass cooling in water, the scraping of pottery shards being shaped into something new. It was the heartbeat of Rome's industry. Even the most mundane items found new purpose. Worn-out sandals were sometimes stripped for their leather. The straps reworked into bindings for scrolls or stitched into new shoes. Wooden crates that once carried grain or wine were disassembled and reshaped into simple furniture or used as firewood. There was a certain practicality in Roman life. Waste not, want not. For a city as large and bustling as Rome, roosing what you had wasn't just a virtue. It was a necessity. One particularly interesting aspect of Roman recycling involved building materials. Rome was in a near constant state of construction and reconstruction. Temples, forums, and public baths rose and fell over the centuries, and when one structure was demolished, its stones were often carted away to be used elsewhere. Entire sections of marble pillars and decorative friezes have been found repurposed in later buildings. Sometimes, you can still see the faint carvings of an earlier time, half buried in the walls of a newer construction. But the Romans didn't stop with stone and clay. They also found ways to repurpose organic waste. Food scraps, discarded vegetable peels, and even animal bones were collected and used as feed for livestock or fertilizer for fields outside the city. Farmers would sometimes pay to cart away this waste, knowing it would enrich their soil and produce better crops. It was a simple cycle. The city's waste fed the countryside, which in turn fed the city. Historians still argue whether this exchange of waste for agricultural use was officially organized or more of an informal agreement between farmers and urban dwellers. Some evidence suggests that city officials regulated the collection of organic waste, while other records imply that it was handled privately by individual farmers. Either way, the system worked. Roman fields flourished, and the city's markets remained stocked with fresh produce. And then there were the metal workers, perhaps the most efficient recyclers of all. Iron, bronze, and even precious metals were rarely discarded. Broken tools, shattered weapons, and even old coins were melted down and reforged. Some of the finest Roman jewelry began its life as scraps from the armory or trimmings from a blacksmith's workshop. Metal wasn't cheap, and the Romans understood its value. They knew that even the most battered piece of iron could be reforged into something new and useful. Picture it, a blacksmith standing over his forge, sweat glistening on his brow as he hammers a misshapen chunk of iron into a smooth blade. The sparks fly, casting tiny flares of light against the soot-covered walls. That blade might have been part of a spear not long ago, or maybe a broken hinge from a marketplace stall. But now, under the rhythmic pounding of the hammer, it's becoming something new, sharper, stronger, ready for another life. Recycling wasn't just a practical measure. It was a reflection of Roman philosophy. Nothing was truly useless. Every broken shard, every discarded tool, every rotting vegetable peel had the potential to be something more. It was a city that, for all its grandeur and ambition, understood the value of renewal. Rome was built on stone and sweat, but it thrived on the ingenuity of reusing what others might simply throw away. But of course, not everything could be reused. Some waste simply piled up, needing a more permanent solution. And so, Rome turned to its ever-growing garbage dumps and landfills. Next, we'll walk through the hills of refuse that grew on the outskirts of the city, monuments not of marble, but of debris, and discover just how Rome kept its streets clear of the things that couldn't be recycled. As the sun dips lower over the bustling skyline of Rome, the shadows stretch long across the cobbled streets and winding alleys. You can almost hear the scrape of brooms and the splash of water as the scoparii finish their work, sweeping away the day's grime. But even with all that effort, not everything can be recycled or washed away. Some things have to be carted off and forgotten, and so we find ourselves at the edge of the city, staring out at Rome's great garbage dumps and landfills. It might seem odd to think of ancient Rome, a place of towering marble temples and grand forums, as having garbage dumps. But for a city of nearly 1 million people, waste management was no small feat. The streets might be swept and the sewers might flow, but the sheer volume of trash generated every day had to go somewhere. And go somewhere it did. Rome's outskirts were dotted with massive landfills, some stretching out for miles, where the refuse of the empire was piled high and left to rot. One of the largest and most famous of these was Monte Testaccio, a man-made hill formed entirely from discarded amphorae, clay jars used to transport olive oil. It's estimated that over 53 million amphorae were dumped there over the span of nearly 300 years. That's right, 53 million. But these weren't just tossed haphazardly. The Romans, ever the engineers, stacked them carefully, layer upon layer, creating a mountain of pottery that still stands today. At its peak, Monte Testaccio reached about 35 meters high and covered an area of roughly 20,000 square meters. What's fascinating is that Monte Testaccio wasn't simply a heap of broken jars. It was an archive of Roman trade. Each amphora was marked with stamps indicating its origin, the producer, and even the weight of its contents. Archaeologists have uncovered shards from all across the empire, Spain, North Africa, and beyond, proving just how far Rome's trade networks reached. You could think of it as an ancient ledger, documenting the ebb and flow of commerce through broken pottery. Historians still argue whether Monte Testaccio was intentionally constructed as a monument to Roman trade, or simply a practical solution to an enormous waste problem. Some believe the careful stacking and the sheer scale of the hill suggest it was meant to showcase Rome's might and control over trade. Others insist it was merely a convenient dumping ground that just happened to grow with each passing shipment. Either way, its presence is a testament to the empire's scale and its waste. But Monte Testaccio was only one part of the puzzle. All around the city, smaller landfills sprang up, each designated for different types of refuse. Near the markets, you'd find piles of discarded vegetable leaves, broken crates, and heaps of spoiled grain. Closer to the industrial districts, the ground was littered with scraps of iron, broken tools, and the ash from blacksmiths' forges. Even the city's tanneries had their own dumping grounds, where rotting leather trimmings and animal bones collected in unpleasant piles. These dumps weren't hidden away. They were part of the landscape, visible reminders of the city's immense consumption. It wasn't uncommon to see waste collectors, the stercorari, loading carts with refuse, and trundling down the wide stone roads toward the outskirts. Their path was often marked by the smell of rotting produce or the sharp tang of tanned leather. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential. Without them, the streets of Rome would have quickly become unwalkable. But not all waste was merely discarded. In a quirk of Roman ingenuity, some of the dumps were mined for materials. That's right, Rome's garbage wasn't always left to rot. Discarded iron and bronze would be collected from the heaps, melted down, and reshaped. Broken tiles and pottery shards were sometimes crushed and used as a base layer for new roads. Even ash from the forges was collected and mixed with lime to create the precursor to concrete. In many ways, these landfills were more like warehouses, holding on to materials that might find a second life. One of the more peculiar forms of waste was ash from cremations. Romans practiced cremation widely, and the remains weren't simply scattered or buried. They were stored in columbaria, underground chambers lined with niches that held urns filled with ashes. While not a landfill in the traditional sense, these columbaria were a form of waste management, carefully cataloging the remains of Roman citizens. In fact, some of these chambers were so vast that they still exist today, preserved beneath the modern city. But what about the more organic forms of waste? The city couldn't exactly toss that into a clay jar and ship it to the outskirts. For that, Rome had its own methods. The cloaca maxima, as you might recall, flushed much of it away. But not everything made it to the sewers. In poorer neighborhoods, waste sometimes collected in alleyways and behind markets, left to fester until the stercorari could collect it. In wealthier districts, homeowners were fined if their refuse wasn't properly disposed of. It was a matter of pride and of public health. Historians still debate how efficient Rome's waste management truly was. Some argue that the sheer scale of the city made it impossible to maintain cleanliness across all neighborhoods. The wealthy areas, of course, received more attention, with regular street sweeping and quicker collection. Meanwhile, the poorer quarters sometimes went days or even weeks without proper waste removal, leading to squalid conditions. Others claim that the Romans were remarkably organized for their time, keeping the city relatively clean despite its size and population density. Imagine standing at the edge of Monte Testaccio, the shards of pottery stretching out in every direction, layer upon layer of olive oil jars glinting in the sunlight. It's almost surreal to think that this wasn't a monument or a temple, but just the city's trash, yet it stands, a testament to Rome's consumption and its ingenuity in handling the byproducts of an empire. Next, we'll take a stroll through the Roman markets, places of chaos and life, where goods from across the empire were traded daily, and where cleanliness wasn't just a preference but a necessity. After all, when you've got fish guts and fruit peels piling up by the hour, somebody's got to keep it all in check. As the sun rises over the bustling streets of Rome, the markets are already alive with the sounds of commerce. Merchants shout their prices, the clatter of wooden carts rattles over cobblestones, and the scent of fresh produce mingles with that of roasting meat. If you wander down the narrow lanes of the Forum Boarium, the city's largest meat market, you'll see traders haggling over sides of beef, freshly plucked chickens, and thick slabs of pork, all hung neatly from iron hooks. The Forum Boarium wasn't just a place to buy meat. It was an experience, but with all that butchering, trading, and cooking came something a bit less glamorous. Waste, animal hides, offcuts, bones, and entrails were a constant byproduct, piling up faster than they could be carted away. For Rome to function, markets like this one had to be kept clean, and the task was monumental. Enter the scoparii and the stercorari, Rome's street sweepers and waste collectors. Every day, well before dawn, they would descend upon the markets with brooms made from bundled reeds and carts pulled by donkeys. Their job was clear the stalls of waste before the crowds poured in. Fish scales and bits of bone were swept into piles, rotting vegetables were carted off, and blood from the slaughtered animals was hosed away using water from the aqueduct-fed fountains, scattered throughout the market. But here's the interesting part. Market cleanliness wasn't just a courtesy. It was legally enforced. According to Roman law, market vendors were responsible for the cleanliness of their own stalls. If you sold fish, you swept up the scales. If you butchered lamb, you handled the bones and blood. The punishment for failing to do so wasn't just a fine. It could mean the temporary loss of your stall, a devastating blow to any merchant's livelihood. In a city as competitive as Rome, losing your place in the market meant losing your income. Historians still debate how strictly these cleanliness laws were enforced. Some argue that the larger, more prominent markets like the Forum Boarium or the Macellum, Rome's grand indoor market, were rigorously monitored by aediles, the public officials tasked with maintaining order and sanitation. Smaller markets and pop-up stalls, however, were less regulated, leading to frequent complaints of foul smells and waste piling up in the streets. It wasn't uncommon for disputes to break out between vendors over who was responsible for a particularly messy stretch of cobblestone. And the mess wasn't just limited to animal products. Wander through the vegetable markets, known as the Forum Holatorium, and you'd find piles of discarded leaves, bruised fruits, and cracked amphorae that once held olive oil or wine. The vendors would sweep what they could into the gutters, where water from the public fountains would carry it away. Anything larger was piled up and left for the stercorari to collect. These collectors would haul the waste out to the edges of the city, where it would be dumped, burned, or, if it was organic, sold to farmers for use as fertilizer. Despite the chaos, there was a strange rhythm to it all. At the end of each market day, the scoparii would move through the stalls like clockwork, sweeping up the remnants of the day's sales. If you walked through the Forum Boarium after dark, you'd see piles of bones stacked neatly by the roadside, ready for collection. Vegetable trimmings would be heaped in carts, and discarded crates would be broken down for firewood. The next morning, the market would reopen, the stalls freshly washed and ready for the cycle to begin again. One quirky bit of history is how the Romans dealt with spoiled goods. In modern markets, rotten vegetables and spoiled meat would simply be thrown away. But in Rome, even the most unappetizing refuse found a purpose. Spoiled vegetables and grains were sometimes collected and fed to pigs, an early form of composting that kept the streets a little cleaner and the livestock a little fatter. Pigs were occasionally allowed to roam the streets, snuffling through piles of discarded food scraps, acting as living garbage disposals. It wasn't the most pleasant sight, but it was effective. But not everything could be left to the pigs. Some waste was simply too hazardous or foul-smelling to be left in the open. Fishmongers, in particular, were notorious for leaving piles of scales and entrails that would stink up the entire block if not properly disposed of. To combat this, Roman markets had designated waste zones, small plots of land on the outskirts of the market where the worst of the refuse was dumped, until it could be carted away. These zones were regularly cleaned by city workers to prevent them from becoming breeding grounds for disease. Historians still argue whether these waste zones were genuinely effective or if they simply shifted the mess from the main streets to the edges of town. Some records suggest that aediles were forced to shut down certain stalls that ignored waste laws too frequently. Others imply that bribery and influence often allowed certain vendors to get away with more than they should have. Regardless, the system worked well enough to keep Rome's markets running, and mostly clean. Imagine strolling through the Forum Boarium as the sun sets, the last of the meat vendors packing up their stalls, the fishmongers hosing down the stone slabs where they worked, and the vegetable sellers sweeping their leftover trimmings into the gutters. You'd hear the splash of water from the fountains as workers rinsed off their carts, and the scrape of brooms brushing the last bits of debris away. It wasn't perfect, but for a city of 1 million people trading everything from salted fish to North African spices, it was a remarkably well-oiled machine, and the markets were just one part of Rome's vast system of cleanliness and organization. Next, we're going to explore what might be the most surprising part of this whole sanitation effort: how the Romans managed the waste of their animals. Because if you think human refuse was a problem, wait until you hear what they did with the endless piles left behind by horses. Cattle and every other four-legged companion that roamed Rome's crowded streets. As you wander away from the bustling markets of Rome, the crowds thin out, and the sounds of haggling vendors fade into the distance. But one sound remains constant: the steady clop of hooves on stone. Horses, oxen, donkeys, and mules pull carts laden with goods. Soldiers ride through the streets on patrol, and wealthy citizens trot by in polished carriages. If you stop for just a moment and take a deep breath, well, let's just say you might regret it. The truth is, for all of Rome's engineering marvels and organized waste management, there was one stubborn problem that persisted: animal waste. With thousands of beasts of burden moving through the city every single day, the streets were dotted with piles of manure, evidence of Rome's unending hustle and bustle. Horses and donkeys weren't just luxury transport. They were the engines of commerce. Carts packed with vegetables, olive oil, pottery, and wine barrels all moved because of these animals, and with them came a constant stream of, well, contributions. To keep the city's avenues passable, Rome employed a special class of worker, the sterquiliniarii. These workers were responsible for collecting animal waste from the streets and carting it off to designated dumping sites. Armed with wide shovels and heavy wooden carts, they would start their rounds early in the morning, moving systematically through the major roads and side alleys, scooping up piles left behind by the endless parade of hooves. It was dirty work, to be sure, but it was vital to keeping the city clean and its citizens from literally wading through muck. But the Romans, being the practical people they were, didn't just throw this waste away. Instead, much of it was repurposed. Farmers from the outskirts of the city would purchase cartloads of manure to fertilize their fields. In fact, it was a booming trade. Waste wasn't seen purely as something to be disposed of. It was a resource. Manure was gathered, piled up outside the city, and left to compost before being sold off. This early form of recycling was part of a cycle that kept Roman agriculture thriving, and the markets stocked with fresh produce. Historians still debate whether this collection and repurposing were officially managed by the city or left to private enterprises. Some argue that the sterquiliniarii were hired directly by the aediles, Rome's public officials, to maintain order and cleanliness. Others suggest that individual farmers made arrangements with collectors, purchasing manure directly as it was gathered. Whatever the case, it worked. Rome stayed relatively clean, and its fields stayed fertile. Of course, the sheer number of animals moving through the city created challenges. Imagine the chaos of the morning rush. Carts trundling through the forum, horses tethered outside markets, donkeys loaded down with sacks of grain trudging up narrow alleyways. The sterquiliniarii had to be quick and efficient, clearing away messes before the streets became impassable. Failure to do so wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Slippery cobblestones, coated in fresh manure, could lead to accidents, and Rome's crowded streets were hazardous enough without adding a layer of filth. Interestingly, the Romans were quite strict about who was responsible for keeping things tidy. If your cart horse left a mess outside someone's villa, it was expected that you, or your hired hand, would clean it up. In fact, there were even fines for those who neglected their duties. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about public health. Animal waste could attract flies and spread disease, so the city enforced these rules with a fair amount of vigor. And it wasn't just horses and donkeys that contributed to the mess. Cattle herds occasionally moved through Rome, especially during market days or seasonal drives. Imagine a dozen cows lumbering through narrow streets, leaving behind what cows tend to leave behind. The sterquiliniarii would follow closely behind, shovels in hand, ready to scoop up the evidence before it became a problem. Some Roman writers even joked that the sterquiliniarii had the most consistent job security in the entire empire. After all, there was never a shortage of work, but perhaps the oddest addition to Rome's waste management system was the humble goose. That's right. Geese were used in certain parts of the city to keep the streets clear of smaller refuse. Geese were known for pecking away at food scraps and bits of debris, a kind of natural street cleaner. They were even kept by some shop owners as a sort of living broom, ensuring that spilled grain and bits of vegetable didn't linger long enough to attract pests. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or merely a quirky tradition in a few districts. Some accounts suggest that certain markets encouraged geese to wander freely, while others claim it was more of a rural habit brought into the city. Either way, the sight of a gaggle of geese waddling through a Roman market, pecking away at scraps, must have been something to behold. Despite all these efforts, Rome was not always pristine. Heavy rains could turn the streets into rivers of mud and muck, mixing animal waste with the dust and debris of daily life. During major festivals, the roads were packed with carts and animals, and even the sterculiniari struggled to keep up. In those times, Rome's streets became chaotic, clogged with waste, until the celebrations passed and order could be restored. But for the most part, Rome managed its animal waste with surprising efficiency. It was a city built on commerce and movement, and that required not just clean streets, but safe ones. Merchants, soldiers, farmers, and everyday citizens could not be slipping and sliding over piles of manure while trying to navigate the crowded avenues. The sterculiniarii may not have been the most glamorous workers in the empire, but they were certainly some of the most essential. Imagine walking through Rome at dawn, before the markets opened and the streets filled with people. You'd hear the soft scrape of shovels on stone, the creak of wooden carts, and the faint clucking of geese pecking at stray grains. It was a strange kind of order, a rhythm of cleanliness that allowed Rome to function, day after day, amidst all its grandeur and chaos. Next, we're going to step away from the dust and the noise of the streets and head toward the public latrines and bathhouses, places where Romans gathered not just to clean themselves, but to socialize, gossip, and conduct business. And, as you might expect, even these spaces had their own surprising standards of sanitation. As you wander away from the bustling streets and the steady clop of hooves, the air grows slightly cooler, and the smell of fresh water and clean stone greets your senses. You're approaching one of Rome's most ingenious feats of public design, the public latrines and bathhouses. These weren't just places to freshen up. They were social hubs, places of gossip, business deals, and surprisingly sophisticated sanitation. The Romans were meticulous when it came to personal cleanliness. Public bathhouses, or thermae, were scattered all across the city. These weren't modest facilities. Many were sprawling complexes that included heated pools, cold baths, steam rooms, exercise areas, and even libraries. The largest of these, like the baths of Caracalla, or the baths of Diocletian, could hold thousands of people at a time. Imagine walking through grand stone archways into a marble-floored hall, steam rising gently from heated pools, sunlight streaming in through massive windows. The sound of water cascading from fountains filled the air, and everywhere you looked, people were lounging, chatting, and soaking away the grime of the city. But the bathhouses were more than just places to get clean. They were vital parts of Rome's sanitation network. Water for these massive complexes was delivered through the city's aqueduct system, ensuring a constant flow of fresh, clean water. The Romans designed the baths with sophisticated plumbing that not only filled the pools, but also drained them regularly, flushing used water out and into the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's vast sewer network. It was a kind of self-cleaning mechanism that kept the water fresh, and the facilities remarkably hygienic for their time. Historians still debate whether the Romans fully understood the link between cleanliness and health, but the evidence suggests they had an intuitive grasp of its importance. Regular bathing wasn't just a luxury, it was a societal expectation. The wealthy had their own private baths, but even the poorest citizens could visit the public thermae for a modest fee, or sometimes even for free. if the local Adel was feeling particularly generous. The government often sponsored free bath days as a way to curry public favor. After all, who doesn't appreciate a hot bath after a long day of dusty Roman streets? Now, when it came to public latrines, the Romans were just as advanced, though you might find their practices a bit unusual. These communal restrooms, called foracae, were open spaces with long stone benches set above continuously flowing water. Holes were spaced evenly along the benches, and beneath them, water from the aqueducts rushed past, carrying waste away into the sewers. There was no privacy. People sat side by side, often chatting or even conducting business as they went about their business. For a society that took its architecture and civic design so seriously, the lack of personal space in the latrines was strangely egalitarian. But perhaps the quirkiest part of Roman latrines was the cleaning method. Instead of toilet paper, users would employ a tersorium, a sponge attached to the end of a stick. After use, the tersorium would be rinsed in a communal water channel that flowed through the latrine. The thought might make you cringe now, but for Romans, it was a perfectly sensible solution. Water flowed constantly, washing away residue, and the sponges were considered clean enough for use. Some scholars argue that vinegar or salt water was sometimes added to the rinse troughs for extra sanitation, though whether that was common practice or just for the particularly cautious remains debated. Interestingly, public latrines weren't just scattered randomly around the city. They were strategically placed near major markets, forums, and public gathering spots to accommodate the flow of traffic. Many were even attached to bathhouses, allowing patrons to relieve themselves before or after their soak. This convenience wasn't just thoughtful, it was necessary. With a population nearing 1 million, Rome needed to make sure its citizens had access to sanitation facilities, and plenty of them. And here's a bit of Roman cleverness. Some latrines were designed with heated seats. That's right, public restrooms with stone benches that were kept warm, either by proximity to a bathhouse furnace or through clever architectural design that captured residual heat. Imagine settling onto warm stone during a chilly Roman winter morning, a small luxury in the midst of communal living. The Romans even had a system for dealing with urine collection. In fact, they found it so valuable that it was taxed, known as the vectigal urinae. This tax was levied on the collectors of public urine, which was then sold to fullers, workers who cleaned and processed wool. Urine, rich in ammonia, was a key component in wool processing, helping to remove grease and soften the fabric. It was common to see clay jars placed around busy public spots where people could relieve themselves, contributing to the collection process. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was lucrative. Historians still argue whether the vectigal urinae was universally accepted, or if it faced pushback from the public. After all, paying a tax on something so basic might seem absurd today. But in Rome, it was considered just another part of city life. Emperor Vespasian famously responded to criticism of the tax by holding a coin to his nose and proclaiming, "Pecunia non olet." Money does not stink. The saying stuck, and so did the tax. It's easy to romanticize Rome for its grand architecture and its powerful legions, but the real ingenuity lay in its ability to manage the practicalities of daily life. Public bathhouses and latrines were not just places for personal care, they were key components of the city's infrastructure. They helped maintain public health, reduced the spread of disease, and, perhaps most importantly, kept Rome functioning as the center of an empire. Imagine it. The sound of rushing water beneath your feet, the soft hum of voices echoing off marble walls, the scent of steam and fresh herbs from the nearby baths, citizens chatting casually as they sit shoulder to shoulder, the flow of water whisking away the refuse of daily life, all while the aqueducts above carry fresh water straight from the hills. It was an elegant solution to a universal problem, one that kept Rome clean, orderly, and surprisingly advanced for its time. Next, we'll head back to the bustling streets and look at a side of Roman life often overlooked. The street urchins and gutter runners, those scrappy survivors who scavenged the city for anything of value, turning waste into opportunity. The sun casts long shadows over the winding alleys of Rome as you step away from the grandeur of the bathhouses and public latrines. The wide streets give way to narrower lanes, where the cobblestones are chipped and uneven, and the bustling crowds thin out. Here, life is a little rougher, the buildings a little more worn, and in these hidden corners of the city, you'd find a peculiar group of people, the street urchins and gutter runners. These children, often orphaned or abandoned, carved out a living in the underbelly of Rome. The grand villas and bustling forums might have been the heart of the empire, but the back streets were its veins, pulsing with life and the constant search for survival. For these urchins, the city's waste was more than just refuse. It was opportunity. They scavenged through the piles left behind by the markets, sifted through the gutters, and even combed the streets after parades and festivals, looking for anything of value. The life of a street urchin wasn't glamorous, but it was resourceful. A broken pottery shard might be cleaned and sold as scrap. Bent nails could be straightened and resold to blacksmiths. Even bits of discarded cloth could be patched together and traded in the markets. For these kids, survival meant seeing value where others saw only trash. They were Rome's original recyclers, scraping by on the fragments of a grand empire. Historians still debate just how organized these groups were. Some argue that the gutter runners operated almost like small guilds, with older boys mentoring the younger ones, teaching them how to spot valuable scraps and avoid trouble with local merchants. Others believe they were purely opportunistic, roaming the streets in small packs, darting from pile to pile, always on the lookout for something they could sell. Either way, their presence was a fixture of Rome's crowded districts. One of the favorite haunts for gutter runners was the bustling Forum Romanum, especially during festivals or large public gatherings. Picture it, crowds cheering as processions marched by, flower petals scattered along the road, confetti fluttering through the air. The children would wait patiently on the sidelines, eyes sharp for coins that might drop from a careless hand. Bits of food abandoned in the rush, or even small trinkets knocked loose in the crowd. As soon as the parade passed, they'd sweep in, gathering whatever they could before the scoparii arrived with their brooms. The more daring urchins would even sneak into the public baths after closing time, hoping to find discarded sandals, forgotten robes, or coins left behind in the changing rooms. Bathhouse attendants weren't always vigilant, and a quick-footed child could slip in and out before anyone noticed. It wasn't exactly legal, but in Rome's crowded streets, sometimes survival meant bending the rules. Some street urchins found their way into more organized work, hired by stercorarii, the waste collectors, to help sort through refuse. These young helpers would comb through the piles of waste, separating bits of metal, glass, and pottery that could be sold. It was dirty work, but it was work for many of these children. It was the only way to earn enough to buy bread or find a place to sleep. And it wasn't just random scraps they were after. Rome's massive public events often left behind a treasure trove of discarded goods. After gladiatorial games or public executions, gruesome as that might sound, the arena grounds were littered with trash. Vendors left behind broken amphorae. Spectators dropped food and drink containers, and the sand itself sometimes concealed coins or trinkets shaken loose in the excitement. The gutter runners would be there as soon as the crowds dispersed, picking through the remains, hoping for a lucky find. One quirky story from Roman history tells of a young boy named Faustus, known in his neighborhood as the Copper King. Faustus had a sharp eye for discarded bits of copper wiring and broken pots. Over the years, he amassed enough scraps to trade directly with a blacksmith. By the time he was 15, he had saved enough money to open his own stall, selling repurposed metal trinkets. His legend lived on as proof that even the gutter runners of Rome could climb the social ladder, one broken shard at a time. Historians still argue about the scale of these operations. Some believe that the street urchins were barely tolerated by the authorities, allowed to scrape by only because they served a purpose in cleaning up minor waste. Others claim that they were occasionally rounded up and removed from the markets, especially during festivals when appearances mattered. It seems likely that their presence was simply accepted as part of the rhythm of Roman life, a kind of living broom that swept through the streets, gathering what the city left behind. In addition to their scavenging, these street urchins often acted as informal messengers or errand runners. Wealthier Romans would sometimes hire them to deliver messages across the city, trusting their quick feet and familiarity with the winding back streets. A few of the luckier ones even found more stable work in the service of merchants or shop owners. Sweeping storefronts or running packages, it wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them from starving. Imagine walking through the narrow back streets of Rome, the air heavy with the scent of market day and the distant echo of street vendors. You'd see them, darting in and out of shadows, eyes sharp and hands quick, always searching for the next bit of copper or the glint of a lost coin. For them, the city's waste was more than just refuse. It was survival. Next, we'll leave behind the winding alleys and re-emerge onto the broader streets to explore how the Romans divided the duties of private versus public responsibility in keeping their mighty city clean. Because while the Scoparii and Stercorarii handled the big stuff, every citizen was expected to do their part or face the consequences. As you step back onto the wider streets of Rome, the chaos of the markets fades behind you, replaced by the steady hum of everyday life. Merchants chat outside their shops, bakers dust flour from their hands onto the stone steps, and artisans hammer away at iron and bronze. It's easy to get swept up in the rhythm of it all. But if you stop and look closer, you'll notice something peculiar. Everyone is sweeping. Shop owners brush away dust from their doorways. Tenants scrub the stones outside their homes, and vendors sweep their stalls clear of debris. In Rome, cleanliness wasn't just a public duty. It was a private responsibility, too. The Romans had a surprisingly modern view of civic responsibility when it came to maintaining the streets. Laws required property owners to keep the stretch of road in front of their buildings clean and passable. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was the law, known as the Lex Julia Municipalis. This ordinance made it clear that if you owned property in Rome, it was your duty to keep it tidy. Failure to do so could result in fines or, worse, public shame. Imagine a busy Roman street, cobbled stones slick from the morning's sweep, the smell of fresh bread wafting from a nearby bakery. If a pile of trash began to gather outside your shop, you wouldn't just shrug it off. Neighbors would take note, and so would the aediles, the public officials responsible for city maintenance. These officials weren't just bureaucrats. They were enforcers. They patrolled the streets, keeping a sharp eye out for neglect. If you were caught slacking, you could be fined on the spot. And in a city as competitive as Rome, that kind of mark on your reputation could be just as costly as the fine itself. Historians still debate how rigorously these laws were enforced across all neighborhoods. In wealthier districts, with their grand villas and polished marble facades, the aediles patrolled regularly, ensuring that the streets stayed pristine. In poorer neighborhoods, enforcement was spottier, and the streets a bit grittier. Some believe that the sheer volume of people living in the slums made it impossible to maintain the same standards, while others argue that local communities often banded together to clean up their own corners, knowing that neglect could bring trouble. But for most Romans, street cleaning was simply part of daily life. Every morning, shop owners would sweep the cobbles, not just for appearances, but because it was expected. Bakers would wash away flour and crumbs, blacksmiths would clear away iron shavings, and wine merchants would mop up spilled drops from yesterday's casks. It was a matter of pride. A clean storefront reflected a well-run business, and Romans took that very seriously. One interesting twist to this system was the concept of shared responsibility. In certain districts, residents would pool their resources to hire Scoparii to sweep their entire block, ensuring that everyone's front step stayed clear. This wasn't charity. It was good business. If your neighbor's stretch of cobblestones was filthy, it reflected poorly on your own property. And so, people chipped in to keep things clean. It was a kind of ancient neighborhood association, but instead of collecting dues for landscaping, they paid for clean streets. streets. And it wasn't just about cleanliness. A tidy street was a safe street. Roman roads were often bustling with carts and wagons, and any debris left scattered about could lead to accidents. Slipping on a pile of vegetable scraps or tripping over a stray stone wasn't just embarrassing. It could be dangerous. In a society where merchants carried their goods in heavy wooden carts, and shoppers strolled in leather-soled sandals, a smooth, clear path was a necessity. To make sure the message was clear, the Romans even established a form of street court, where disputes about cleanliness and maintenance were settled. If you believed your neighbor wasn't pulling their weight, you could take the matter to a local magistrate. Witnesses would be called. Evidence would be presented, and if the claim was found to be true, fines could be levied. These street disputes weren't uncommon, and for some neighborhoods, they became part of the social fabric, an early version of civic accountability. But public enforcement didn't stop there. The aediles also inspected public fountains and water channels to ensure they were free from debris. These fountains weren't just decorative, they were essential for daily life, providing fresh drinking water and a place to wash away grime. If one became clogged or polluted, the aediles could fine the locals responsible for the area. The expectation was clear. You didn't just keep your own steps clean. You took care of your neighborhood too. Historians still argue whether these civic duties were universally followed, or if it was mostly the wealthier classes who kept up appearances. There's evidence to suggest that wealthier Romans sometimes paid others to maintain their portions of the street, while poorer residents simply did the best they could with what they had. In wealthier areas like the Palatine Hill, marble paths were washed down with water drawn from private wells, and waste was swept away almost instantly. In the crowded slums of the Subura, the cleanup was less polished, though still maintained to avoid fines. It wasn't all enforcement and punishment, though some wealthier Romans saw an opportunity in this civic expectation. They would sponsor street cleaning projects in poorer districts, paying for scopari to sweep the streets and keep the gutters clear. In return, they earned the goodwill of their neighbors and, sometimes, political favors. A clean street meant safer travel, better business, and, perhaps most importantly, public favor. Imagine walking down a busy Roman street at dawn. Shopkeepers are already out front, sweeping away the dust of yesterday, scrubbing stones with water drawn from the nearest fountain. You pass by bakers brushing flour off their doorsteps, and merchants sweeping away scraps of cloth and pottery. The smell of fresh bread mingles with the faint scent of lavender, sometimes sprinkled along the cobblestones to freshen the air. It's a rhythm of cleanliness and order, a shared responsibility that kept Rome's streets bustling, beautiful, and mostly clean. Next, we'll move away from the shop fronts and explore the grand bathhouses and runoff channels, where Rome's obsession with cleanliness flowed from marble pools to the very gutters of the streets. You'll be amazed at how the waters of luxury became the very tools of sanitation for the city. As you move back toward the grand boulevards of Rome, the sound of water grows louder, gushing, splashing, cascading through stone channels. You're approaching one of Rome's greatest obsessions, its bathhouses. These were more than just places to wash. They were palatial centers of social life, relaxation, and yes, even street sanitation. The Romans didn't just use water, they mastered it, turning its flow into an art form that kept both bodies and streets clean. The grandest of these public bathhouses, or thermae, were architectural marvels. The baths of Caracalla, for example, sprawled across acres of land, with towering arches, heated pools, and expansive gardens. Marble statues lined the corridors, and mosaics glittered beneath the surface of steaming pools. It wasn't just a place to bathe. It was a place to be seen, to conduct business, and to engage in the city's social fabric. Senators, merchants, and everyday citizens all mingled here, soaking in hot water, scrubbing away the dust of Rome. and gossiping about the latest political scandal. But behind the beauty lay a masterpiece of engineering. These bathhouses were fed by Rome's vast network of aqueducts, channels that carried fresh water from distant springs and rivers. Gravity did the work. Stone arches supported the weight of water, guiding it smoothly down from the hills and into the city. At its height, Rome had 11 aqueducts funneling millions of gallons of water each day into its fountains, homes, and of course, the mighty bathhouses. The process was astonishingly efficient. Water would flow from the aqueducts into massive holding tanks within the bathhouse. From there, it was heated using massive furnaces, which were stoked day and night to keep the baths warm and inviting. The hot water would be directed into large communal pools, where bathers would first sit and soak. After sweating out the grime of the city, they would move through a series of pools, each progressively cooler, rinsing off and refreshing themselves before emerging back into the bustling streets. Historians still debate how often the water in these massive baths was changed. Some suggest that it was a daily ritual, with fresh water flushing out the old. Others believe that only a portion was drained at a time, mixed with fresh inflow to keep it usable. Whatever the method, the water was constantly moving, flowing in, circulating through, and draining back out. And that drainage system, it wasn't just an afterthought. It was a crucial part of Rome's street sanitation. Once the bathwater had served its purpose, it wasn't simply tossed away. It flowed out through carefully constructed runoff channels, emptying into the city's sewers and, eventually, into the Cloaca Maxima. But before it reached the Great Sewer, the water often washed through the city's gutters, flushing away dirt, debris, and refuse from the streets. In fact, public officials would time the release of bathwater to coincide with the busiest market hours, allowing the surge of water to sweep the cobblestones clean. It was a bit like turning on the city's faucet, letting fresh water flush out the grime of daily life. The sound of water trickling through gutters was a familiar one in Rome. It carried with it the remnants of market stalls, crushed grapes, vegetable peels, and stray bits of parchment. It washed away dust from merchant carts, and even diluted the horse droppings left behind by the constant flow of traffic. Some neighborhoods even had public fountains with overflows that deliberately ran down the streets, keeping them slick and fresh. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the worst of the filth from piling up. One of the quirkiest aspects of this system was the bathhouse runoff markets. In certain districts, local farmers would wait near the outlets of the bathhouse drains to collect the outflowing water. They used it to irrigate their small gardens just outside the city walls, taking advantage of the warm, mineral-rich water. The Romans had a saying for it: aqua nova, vita nova, new water, new life. It was just another example of how the city thrived on resourcefulness. Historians still argue whether this reuse of bathhouse water was officially sanctioned or simply a practical adaptation by the locals. Some records suggest that the city supported the practice, even marking certain channels as safe for irrigation. Others believe it was a purely opportunistic practice by savvy farmers looking to squeeze every drop of utility from the city's waste. Regardless, it worked, and Rome's outskirts flourished with crops grown from the remnants of city life. And it wasn't just the bathhouses that contributed to this flow of water. Public fountains, scattered throughout the city, poured fresh water into the streets day and night. Some of these fountains were grand structures, like the Fontana dell'Acqua Vergine, while others were simple spouts, pouring directly into stone basins. People would gather here to fill their jugs, wash their hands, and sometimes even clean their laundry. The overflow was directed down the streets, ensuring that even the poorest districts received a trickle of fresh water to flush away the day's grime. It's easy to romanticize the marble and mosaics of Rome, but its true brilliance lay in its infrastructure. The water that poured from its aqueducts didn't just disappear. It moved through the city like blood through veins, washing the streets, flushing the gutters, and nourishing the fields beyond its walls. Imagine standing in the Forum as the fountains gush with fresh water, spilling into the gutters, sweeping away dust and dirt. You'd hear the splash and gurgle of water beneath your feet, a constant reminder that the city, for all its grandeur, was as practical as it was beautiful. Next, we'll step away from the rushing water and head into the crowded heart of Rome's religious districts, where temples and shrines stood as beacons of faith, and where even the gods demanded a certain standard of cleanliness. Because in Rome, keeping the streets clean wasn't just about health. It was about respect for the divine. As you walk away from the bustling bathhouses and the whispering streams of aqueduct water, the air shifts subtly. It grows quieter, more solemn, and the hum of commerce fades into hushed whispers and murmured prayers. You've stepped into one of Rome's most sacred spaces, the temple districts, where towering columns stretch toward the sky, and the scent of incense lingers thick in the air. Here, amidst the grandeur of marble and the flicker of oil lamps, cleanliness wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. In Rome, the idea of religious purity went hand in hand with physical cleanliness. Temples dedicated to gods like Jupiter, Venus, and Mars were maintained with strict rituals of purification. Stone steps were scrubbed, marble statues were polished, and the altars, often still sticky with the residue of offerings, were washed clean after every ritual. This wasn't just a matter of appearances. The Romans believed that filth attracted misfortune and disrespect to the gods. Keeping sacred spaces clean was a form of devotion, a physical act that symbolized spiritual purity. The priests, known as flamines, oversaw this meticulous upkeep. Armed with reed brooms and cloths dipped in perfumed water, they would sweep the stone floors and scrub the altar spaces. It wasn't just about removing dust. It was about sanctifying the space. Offerings left by worshippers, fruits, grains, small statues, were carefully collected and either preserved for future rituals or disposed of respectfully. Nothing was left to rot or decay on holy ground. Historians still debate the extent of Rome's obsession with temple cleanliness. Some argue that the grandeur of the major temples, like the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, set a standard that smaller, neighborhood shrines could never match. Others suggest that even the smallest roadside altars, the kind you'd stumble across at random street corners, were kept remarkably clean out of sheer reverence. After all, to neglect the shrine of a god was to risk their wrath, and that was a chance few Romans were willing to take. The Roman people took this responsibility seriously. It wasn't uncommon to see everyday citizens stopping to tidy up a local shrine, removing dead flowers, brushing away dust, and ensuring that offerings were properly placed. In fact, certain neighborhoods took great pride in the upkeep of their local temples. This wasn't just a matter of faith. It was a matter of community honor. A well-kept shrine reflected well on the families that lived nearby, while a neglected one was a source of shame. And it wasn't just the temples themselves that had to be kept clean. The streets leading to these sacred spaces were held to a higher standard as well. The path to a temple was called the Via Sacra, or Sacred Way, and it was swept daily by the scoparia, even in the busiest parts of the city. The streets leading to the temples remained clean and free of refuse. Vendors were forbidden from setting up stalls too close, and carts were kept from blocking the pathways. It was as if the streets themselves participated in the act of worship, cleared of filth and clutter in deference to the divine. One particularly curious tradition involved the festival days. During major religious celebrations, such as the Lupercalia or Saturnalia, the streets near the temples were covered in fresh flower petals. Early in the morning, priests and temple attendants would scatter rose petals and sprigs of laurel across the stone pathways, symbolizing purification and renewal. The scent of fresh blooms mingled with the sharp tang of incense, filling the air with an almost otherworldly aroma. As the crowds gathered for the festivities, they would walk upon paths softened by petals, the dust and dirt of everyday life momentarily swept away. Historians still argue whether this practice was purely symbolic or if it had practical applications as well. Some suggest that the petals acted as a form of early street sanitation, covering up mud and softening the tread of heavy sandals. Others insist it was purely ritualistic, a gesture of respect for the gods that transcended practical concerns. Perhaps it was both, a little bit of magic woven into the everyday dust of the city. But not all temples were grand marble structures. Scattered across Rome were tiny wayside shrines, simple stone carvings, or small wooden statues nestled into the walls of buildings. These shrines were just as sacred as the grand temples, and they were maintained by the locals. Every morning, shopkeepers and residents would sweep the stones around them, lighting candles and placing fresh flowers as offerings. Some of these shrines were dedicated to household gods, the Lares and Penates, who were believed to watch over homes and families. A dirty shrine was considered bad luck, a sign of disrespect that might bring misfortune. The care for these sacred spaces wasn't limited to the locals either. When the city held religious parades or grand festivals, special crews of scopari were dispatched to ensure that every stone along the parade route was spotless. This wasn't just for show. It was believed that the gods would bless a city that honored them with cleanliness and order. Even the emperor's own guard would participate in these cleanup efforts, sweeping the paths before the imperial procession moved through. To see soldiers of Rome bending to brush dust from the path was a reminder that even the powerful showed deference to the divine. And it wasn't just for the gods. Rome believed that a clean temple district reflected well on the entire city. Travelers from distant provinces would visit the temples, and the state of the sacred grounds was a point of pride. To have refuse or decay anywhere near the gods' dwellings was unthinkable, a stain not just on the neighborhood, but on Rome itself. It was a symbol of Roman superiority, proof that their gods and their city were blessed with order and majesty. Imagine standing at the base of the Temple of Jupiter, the sun gleaming off its marble pillars, the path before you swept clean and dusted with petals. The scent of burning myrrh drifts through the air as priests chant softly, their voices mingling with the whispers of the crowd. Everything is pristine, polished, sanctified. In Rome, cleanliness wasn't just about health. It was a way to honor the gods, to show respect to the divine forces believed to watch over the city. Next, we'll step away from the temples and back into the heart of the city to explore Rome's sprawling garbage dumps and landfills. Because for all their attention to cleanliness, the Romans still had to figure out where to put all that refuse. And what they did with it might surprise you. The bustling heart of Rome never truly sleeps, even as the markets quiet down and the shadows grow long. The hum of carts and the shuffle of feet persist. It's a city that breathes, constantly churning out goods, and with them, an unending stream of garbage. For all its grand architecture and sophisticated water systems, Rome still had to face the practical question: where did all that waste go? As you wander toward the outskirts of the city, the air grows thicker, the smell of dust and decay more pronounced. You find yourself standing before one of Rome's most practical and perhaps least glamorous innovations: the garbage dumps and landfills. These weren't small, discrete piles of refuse tucked away from sight. They were sprawling landscapes, vast expanses where Rome's discarded pottery, broken tools, shattered glass, and spoiled food collected day after day. One of the largest and most infamous of these dumps was Monte Testaccio, a hill that still stands today, a literal mountain of broken amphorae. These clay jars, used primarily to transport olive oil, were discarded here by the millions. Archaeologists estimate that over 53 million amphorae are piled within the hill, layer upon layer, carefully stacked over centuries. It wasn't just a chaotic pile. It was organized. The jars were broken into manageable pieces, stacked methodically, and covered with lime to reduce the smell and the risk of fire. It's hard to imagine that a hill made of shattered pottery could be so meticulously constructed, but that was the Roman way, order even in waste. Historians still debate the purpose of this carefully organized heap. Some believe it was simply a practical solution to an overflow of ceramic waste. Others suggest that Monte Testaccio served as a kind of ledger, a physical record of Rome's trade in olive oil. The amphorae were marked with stamps indicating their origin, the producer, and sometimes even the date of manufacture. In this way, Monte Testaccio became not just a landfill, but a historical archive, a broken mosaic that, when pieced together, tells the story of Rome's global trade. But Monte Testaccio was just the most famous of Rome's many garbage dumps. All across the city, refuse was collected and carted off to designated sites. The stercorari, Rome's waste collectors, were responsible for hauling the garbage from market stalls, private homes, and public spaces. Early each morning, you'd see their wooden carts creaking over the cobblestones, piled high with broken pottery, rotting vegetables, and discarded scraps. The stercorari would load up their carts, often helped by the city's poor or even street urchins, and trundle out to the edges of the city where the waste was dumped, layered, and left to rot. But Rome didn't just dump its garbage. It found ways to repurpose it. Some of the waste collected by the stercorari was separated out, with metal scraps salvaged and melted down, pottery shards ground into dust for construction projects, and even organic waste composted for use as fertilizer. Farmers from the countryside would sometimes purchase cartloads of refuse, knowing that even the most unappealing piles could enrich their soil. The Romans were practical like that. Even their waste wasn't truly wasted. One particularly interesting aspect of Roman garbage disposal was its impact on the city's infrastructure. Over time, as layers of debris built up, certain roads and pathways actually rose higher than they had been originally. Archaeologists digging beneath modern Rome have found entire streets buried under centuries of layered garbage, preserved in time by the sheer volume of refuse. It's almost as if Rome grew not just outward, but upward, building its foundations on the remnants of daily life. Historians still argue about how well-regulated these dumps truly were. Some suggest that the stercorari were organized and efficient, maintaining set schedules and designated dumping grounds. Others believe that Rome's garbage collection was more chaotic, with piles springing up wherever there was space, and gradually growing into permanent fixtures. Monte Testaccio may have been a well-maintained anomaly, a glimpse of Roman order in an otherwise messy system. There were also illegal dumps, places where merchants or households would toss their trash to avoid the costs associated with proper disposal. These rogue piles were usually tucked away in abandoned lots, or along the city's edges, out of sight from the prying eyes of the aediles. When discovered, fines could be steep, and public shaming was not uncommon, but the practice persisted. After all, waste disposal wasn't cheap, and for many, it was easier to let refuse disappear into the shadows. And it wasn't just physical waste. Human waste that didn't make it into the latrines or the sewers sometimes found its way into these dumps. Slop jars from poorer households, animal carcasses from market days, and refuse from tanneries all contributed to the growing piles. In some parts of the city, the buildup was so intense that special crews were dispatched to clear away the refuse before it became a health hazard. It was a constant battle, one that the city never truly won, but managed well enough to keep its streets mostly navigable. One quirk of Roman waste disposal was its seasonality. During the winter months, the piles grew higher as fewer carts made the rounds through the icy streets. In the summer, when the city swelled with merchants and travelers, the stercorari worked overtime to keep the roads clear. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep Rome running smoothly, at least most of the time. Imagine standing atop Monte Testaccio, shards of amphorae crunching beneath your feet, stretching out as far as you can see. Each fragment is a whisper of the past. A merchant's jug from Spain, an olive oil shipment from North Africa, a clay pot stamped with the name of its maker. It's a testament to the scale of Roman life and the practical methods they employed to keep the city moving forward. Even in its trash, Rome was grand. Next, we'll leave behind the dust and debris of the landfills and explore a different kind of Roman ingenuity. Recycling the Roman way, Because for all its extravagance, Rome understood the value of reusing what it already had, and it might surprise you just how inventive they were. The bustling heart of Rome never truly sleeps. Even as the markets quiet down and the shadows grow long, the hum of carts and the shuffle of feet persist. It's a city that breathes, constantly churning out goods, and with them, an unending stream of garbage. For all its grand architecture and sophisticated water systems, Rome still had to face the practical question: where did all that waste go? As you wander toward the outskirts of the city, the air grows thicker, the smell of dust and decay more pronounced. You find yourself standing before one of Rome's most practical and perhaps least glamorous innovations. The garbage dumps and landfills. These weren't small, discrete piles of refuse tucked away from sight. They were sprawling landscapes, vast expanses where Rome's discarded pottery, broken tools, shattered glass, and spoiled food collected day after day. One of the largest and most infamous of these dumps was Monte Testaccio, a hill that still stands today. A literal mountain of broken amphorae. These clay jars, used primarily to transport olive oil, were discarded here by the millions. Archaeologists estimate that over 53 million amphorae are piled within the hill, layer upon layer, carefully stacked over centuries. It wasn't just a chaotic pile. It was organized. The jars were broken into manageable pieces, stacked methodically, and covered with lime to reduce the smell and the risk of fire. It's hard to imagine that a hill made of shattered pottery could be so meticulously constructed. But that was the Roman way, order even in waste. Historians still debate the purpose of this carefully organized heap. Some believe it was simply a practical solution to an overflow of ceramic waste. Others suggest that Monte Testaccio served as a kind of ledger, a physical record of Rome's trade in olive oil. The amphorae were marked with stamps indicating their origin, the producer, and sometimes even the date of manufacture. In this way, Monte Testaccio became not just a landfill, but a historical archive, a broken mosaic that, when pieced together, tells the story of Rome's global trade. But Monte Testaccio was just the most famous of Rome's many garbage dumps. All across the city, refuse was collected and carted off to designated sites. The stercorarii, Rome's waste collectors, were responsible for hauling the garbage from market stalls, private homes, and public spaces. Early each morning, you'd see their wooden carts creaking over the cobblestones, piled high with broken pottery, rotting vegetables, and discarded scraps. The stercorarii would load up their carts, often helped by the city's poor or even street urchins, and trundle out to the edges of the city where the waste was dumped, layered, and left to rot. But Rome didn't just dump its garbage, it found ways to repurpose it. Some of the waste collected by the stercorarii was separated out, with metal scraps salvaged and melted down, pottery shards ground into dust for construction projects, and even organic waste composted for use as fertilizer. Farmers from the countryside would sometimes purchase cartloads of refuse, knowing that even this most unappealing piles could enrich their soil. The Romans were practical like that. Even their waste wasn't truly wasted. One particularly interesting aspect of Roman garbage disposal was its impact on the city's infrastructure. Over time, as layers of debris built up, certain roads and pathways actually rose higher than they had been originally. Archaeologists digging beneath modern Rome have found entire streets buried under centuries of layered garbage, preserved in time by the sheer volume of refuse. It's almost as if Rome grew not just outward, but upward, building its foundations on the remnants of daily life. Historians still argue about how well-regulated these dumps truly were. Some suggest that the stercorarii were organized and efficient, maintaining set schedules and designated dumping grounds. Others believe that Rome's garbage collection was more chaotic, with piles springing up wherever there was space, and gradually growing into permanent fixtures. Monte Testaccio may have been a well-maintained anomaly, a glimpse of Roman order in an otherwise messy system. There were also illegal dumps, places where merchants or households would toss their trash to avoid the costs associated with proper disposal. These rogue piles were usually tucked away in abandoned lots, or along the city's edges, out of sight from the prying eyes of the adels. When discovered, fines could be steep, and public shaming was not uncommon. But the practice persisted. After all, waste disposal wasn't cheap, and for many, it was easier to let refuse disappear into the shadows. And it wasn't just physical waste. Human waste that didn't make it into the latrines or the sewers sometimes found its way into these dumps. Slop jars from poorer households, animal carcasses from market days, and refuse from tanneries all contributed to the growing piles. In some parts of the city, the buildup was so intense that special crews were dispatched to clear away the refuse before it became a health hazard. It was a constant battle, one that the city never truly won, but managed well enough to keep its streets mostly navigable. One quirk of Roman waste disposal was its seasonality. During the winter months, the piles grew higher as fewer carts made the rounds through the icy streets. In the summer, when the city swelled with merchants and travelers, the stercorarii worked overtime to keep the roads clear. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep Rome running smoothly, at least most of the time. Imagine standing atop Monte Testaccio, shards of amphorae crunching beneath your feet, stretching out as far as you can see. Each fragment is a whisper of the past: a merchant's jug from Spain, an olive oil shipment from North Africa, a clay pot stamped with the name of its maker. It's a testament to the scale of Roman life and the practical methods they employed to keep the city moving forward. Even in its trash, Rome was grand. Next, we'll leave behind the dust and debris of the landfills and explore a different kind of Roman ingenuity, recycling the Roman way. Because for all its extravagance, Rome understood the value of reusing what it already had, and it might surprise you just how inventive they were. As you leave the towering shards of Monte Testaccio behind, the streets grow narrower, the noise of markets and carts fades to a low hum, and you find yourself wandering through the quieter, industrious parts of Rome. Here, blacksmiths hammer away at iron, glassblowers shape molten glass into delicate forms, and potters spin clay into amphora, destined for wine and olive oil. But amidst all this creation, something unexpected catches your eye: recycling. The Roman way. It might surprise you to learn that the Romans were remarkably resourceful when it came to reusing materials. In a city as vast and bustling as Rome, waste wasn't something to be casually discarded. It was a resource waiting to be transformed. Broken pots, shattered glass, splintered wood. Almost nothing went to waste if it could be repurposed. You could call it an ancient form of sustainability, born not from environmental consciousness, but from sheer necessity. One of the most commonly recycled materials in Rome was pottery, amphorae, those large clay jars used to transport olive oil, wine, and grain were prone to breaking. When they did, their shards weren't simply tossed aside. Instead, they were collected, sorted, and often ground into powder to be mixed with lime and used as a type of cement for construction projects. You'd find bits of broken pottery embedded in the mortar of public buildings, shrines, and even aqueducts. It was a practical way to extend the life of these clay vessels long after their original purpose had been fulfilled. But the ingenuity didn't stop there. Roman artisans also found ways to repurpose pottery shards as writing surfaces, known as ostraca. These fragments became makeshift notepads for quick messages, market lists, or even tax records. It wasn't uncommon to see merchants scribbling notes on pieces of broken amphorae, handing them off to messengers, or using them as temporary records. In fact, entire inventories of trade goods have been discovered, written on these clay fragments. Preserving a snapshot of daily commerce in the city, historians still debate whether the widespread use of ostraca was a matter of necessity or simply convenience. Some argue that it was born out of Rome's economic pragmatism. Why waste good clay when it could be written upon? Others suggest it was simply a tradition that lingered from earlier times. Regardless of the reason, it worked. Even shattered pottery had value in the hands of the Romans. Glass was another material that found new life in Rome. Unlike pottery, which was ground down and mixed with lime, glass could be melted and reshaped. Broken glassware wasn't simply discarded. It was collected by glass blowers who would reheat it, melt it down, and craft it into new items. Sometimes the glass was transformed into small vials or decorative beads. Other times, it was refashioned into elegant drinking vessels or tiny perfume bottles. The Romans even experimented with colored glass, adding minerals during the melting process to create vibrant blues, greens, and ambers. Shops specializing in glasswork thrived in the markets, selling both newly crafted items and recycled glassware. For the wealthier classes, bespoke glass pieces were in high demand. But even the poorer citizens had access to simple glass containers crafted from recycled shards. And it wasn't just glass and pottery. Rome also found ways to recycle metal. Iron, bronze, and copper were precious commodities, and broken tools or rusted weapons weren't simply thrown away. Instead, they were collected, melted down, and reforged. Blacksmiths worked long hours, pounding misshapen lumps of metal back into useful forms. A bent sword might become a kitchen knife, a snapped spearhead reshaped into a chisel. Nothing was wasted if it could be melted and reformed. One particularly clever example of metal recycling came from Roman coins. When older coins were damaged or wore thin, they were collected by the state, melted down, and reminted. This wasn't just practical. It was political. The refreshed coins often bore the face of the current emperor, reinforcing his image and authority with every transaction. It was a subtle but powerful way to keep the emperor's likeness in the hands of the people, literally circulating through the city's markets and temples. Historians still argue how centralized this recycling effort really was. Some believe the Roman government actively encouraged the reuse of materials as a matter of public policy. Others think it was simply a byproduct of a practical society where waste equaled opportunity, and nothing was thrown away without a second thought. Perhaps it was a bit of both. A collective mindset driven by practicality and a touch of imperial influence. Even stone and marble found their way back into Roman life. When older buildings were demolished, their marble columns and carved stones weren't left to crumble. Instead, they were collected, cleaned, and repurposed in new constructions. Sometimes, you'd find stones that still bore the faint etchings of their original design. Half buried in the walls of a newer building, it wasn't uncommon to spot a column that once graced a temple, now serving as part of a storefront awning. Rome built its present on the ruins of its past, layer by layer, stone by stone. One particularly odd example of Roman recycling came in the form of bone and horn. When animals were slaughtered for meat, their bones were collected and carved into tools, buttons, and even musical instruments. Horn was boiled and softened, then pressed into molds to create small containers or decorative pieces. Workshops specializing in bone carving could be found in certain districts, their tables piled high with scraps ready to be transformed into something new. Imagine walking through a Roman marketplace, your sandals clicking against stones that might once have been part of a senator's villa. Pottery shards crunch underfoot. Remnants of last month's olive oil shipment, now repurposed as paving material. In the shops, you'd see delicate glass vials, some shimmering with color, forged from yesterday's broken jars. Even the coins you carry, gleaming with the emperor's image, might have been something else entirely just a few years ago. In Rome, nothing was wasted, not when it could be reforged, remelted, or reshaped. Next, we'll move beyond the markets and artisans to the very heart of Rome, the Forum, where political power and civic pride demanded not just cleanliness, but a pristine image. After all, when the eyes of the world are watching, even the dust must be swept away. As you step out of the narrow, industrious lanes of Rome's workshops, the world opens up before you into a grand expanse of marble columns, towering statues, and polished stone pathways. You've arrived at the Roman Forum, the beating heart of the empire's political, economic, and social life. Here, senators debated the future of nations, merchants haggled over precious goods, and citizens gathered to hear proclamations from the emperor himself. It wasn't just a marketplace. It was a symbol of Roman power and order, and keeping it clean was nothing short of a civic obsession. The Forum wasn't just swept, it was polished. Each morning, long before the first merchant had unpacked his wares, or the senators arrived in their flowing togas. The scoparii were already hard at work, armed with their bundled reed brooms and buckets of fresh water from the aqueducts. They swept every inch of the massive square. Dust was brushed from the cobblestones, debris was carted off, and even the cracks between the stones were meticulously cleared of dirt and pebbles. The Romans took pride in their city, and nowhere was that pride more evident than in the Forum. It wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was political. The Forum was a place of spectacle and power. Foreign dignitaries walked its paths. Ambassadors from distant lands strolled beneath its arches, and the emperor himself often made appearances. To present anything less than perfection would be to show weakness. The cleanliness of the Forum was a reflection of Rome's dominance. Orderly, grand, and meticulously maintained. Historians still debate whether the cleanliness of the Forum was achieved primarily through civic pride or if it was a matter of political necessity. Some argue that the emperor's insistence on cleanliness was a strategy to impress visiting dignitaries and solidify Rome's image as the pinnacle of civilization. Others believe it was simply a product of Roman values, an extension of their obsession with order and public decency. Perhaps it was a bit of both, pride and politics interwoven with every sweep of the broom. Beyond the sweeping, the Forum underwent regular washing and polishing. Public fountains, fed by the city's aqueducts, spilled fresh water into the square, which was used to flush away dust and grime. Stones were scrubbed with stiff brushes, their surfaces polished until they shone under the sun. Even the statues that lined the pathways were regularly cleaned, their marble faces scrubbed free of dust and bird droppings. On festival days, the statues were sometimes adorned with fresh flowers, their bases swept and sprinkled with water to keep the dust down. One of the most labor-intensive tasks was the upkeep of the marble paving stones. The Romans took enormous pride in their marble. Its smooth, reflective surface was a symbol of wealth and power. To let it crack or dull from dirt was considered an insult to the gods and a stain on the city's reputation. Workers would crawl on hands and knees, scrubbing the stones with a mixture of ash and water, polishing them to a near mirror-like finish. During festivals or public ceremonies, flower petals would sometimes be scattered across the ground, only to be swept away the next morning before the sun had fully risen. But the cleanliness of the Forum wasn't just maintained by the state. Local merchants who operated stalls in the area were also responsible for keeping their spaces tidy, much like the rules enforced in the market districts. Vendors were required to sweep their patches of stone and ensure that waste was properly collected and disposed of. Inspectors, often sent by the aediles, would patrol the Forum regularly, issuing fines to anyone who neglected their duties. One curious practice was the public sweeping contests occasionally held by the aediles to encourage cleanliness. Merchants would compete to see who could keep their section of the Forum the cleanest over the course of a week. Winners were sometimes awarded small tokens, perhaps a reduction in their market fees or priority in stall placement during festivals. It wasn't much, but the recognition was valuable, and the competition fierce. Cleanliness wasn't just civic duty. It was good business. Historians still argue whether these contests were more spectacle than substance. Some believe they were primarily organized as a way to show off Rome's grandeur to foreign visitors, while others insist they genuinely improved the cleanliness of the Forum. Either way, the results were hard to dispute. On contest days, the stones gleamed, the fountains sparkled, and the Forum felt like the heart of a thriving empire. The Romans also had a knack for recycling public waste collected from the Forum. Scraps of cloth, broken pottery, and even discarded bits of iron were gathered up and sorted. Merchants would sometimes buy these materials directly from the city, repurposing them for their own trades. This wasn't just a clever way to keep the Forum clean, it also generated revenue for the city, turning waste into wealth with surprising efficiency. Imagine standing in the forum at dawn, the sun just cresting over the marble columns of the Basilica Julia. The square is spotless, the stone paths gleaming with morning dew, the statues standing tall and immaculate. Merchants arrive and begin to set up their stalls, sweeping their spaces, straightening their goods, and nodding politely to the adels who stroll by with sharp eyes. This was the center of Rome, not just in geography, but in spirit. Clean, orderly, powerful. For the Romans, the Forum wasn't just a marketplace. It was a statement. It said to every citizen, every visitor, and every foreign dignitary that Rome was a place of order and majesty. It was a place where the dirt and chaos of daily life were swept away each morning, replaced with polished stone and pristine marble. To walk through the Forum was to walk through the very essence of Roman civilization, clean, mighty, and unyielding. Next, we'll take a turn down one of those polished avenues and find ourselves in the residential districts of Rome, where the grand villas of the rich met the crowded insula of the poor. And while the Forum gleamed with power and pride, the neighborhoods of Rome had their own methods of keeping the streets clean, methods that were a bit more chaotic, but no less inventive. Leaving behind the grandeur and gleaming marble of the Forum, you make your way down one of Rome's winding streets, past bustling market stalls and shouting vendors. The smooth stone gives way to narrower alleys, and the air grows heavier with the scent of cooked food, spiced wine, and the unmistakable tang of crowded living. You've arrived in the residential districts of Rome, a patchwork of sprawling villas and towering insulae, the multi-story apartment blocks that housed the bulk of Rome's population. In these neighborhoods, the daily battle for cleanliness took on a different kind of rhythm. The grand villas of the wealthy boasted private courtyards with mosaic floors, manicured gardens, and even their own private sewer connections to the Cloaca Maxima. These privileged residents had slaves and servants dedicated to sweeping the courtyards, scrubbing the walls, and clearing debris from the stone paths. Waste was discreetly removed through hidden doorways and flushed out through underground pipes, out of sight, out of mind. For the wealthy, cleanliness was simply another luxury that came with status. But as you wander deeper into the maze of alleys, the villas shrink away, replaced by the towering shadows of insulae. These apartment blocks, sometimes as high as 6 or 7 stories, were home to Rome's working class, the artisans, laborers, and merchants who kept the city alive. Life in the insulae was crowded, chaotic, and always noisy. Families lived in small, cramped quarters, with entire households often sharing a single floor. Here, cleanliness was more of a challenge, but it was no less a necessity. Unlike the villas with their private drainage, the residents of insulae relied on shared public latrines and communal wells. Waste disposal was a community effort, and it wasn't always handled with the same meticulousness as in wealthier districts. Small clay pots, known as chamber pots, were used for nightly needs and then emptied, sometimes with warning, sometimes without, into the streets below. The familiar cry of "guard low" or "watch out for the water" was borrowed later by the French, but was very much a Roman tradition. The unlucky passer-by who ignored the shout might find themselves splashed with far more than just water. Historians still debate how common this practice was, and whether it was legally tolerated. Officially, Roman law prohibited the dumping of waste from windows, with fines for those caught in the act. But in the crowded lanes of the insulae, enforcement was spotty, and practicality often won out over legality. In the morning, it wasn't uncommon to see scoparii trudging through the narrow streets, their brooms scraping the stone as they swept away the night's debris. But waste wasn't just tossed out the window. Rome had a unique system of public waste pits strategically placed in busier residential areas. These pits, called puticuli served as communal dumping grounds where residents could dispose of trash, food scraps, and broken pottery. The stercorarii would make their rounds each morning, collecting the refuse and carting it away to the outskirts of the city. For many in the insulae, this was the most efficient way to deal with their daily waste. Yet even with these systems in place, life in the insula was far from pristine. Streets grew cluttered with market scraps, and animal waste from passing carts often piled up faster than the stercorarii could clear it. The narrowness of the alleys made sweeping a challenge, and the upper stories of the buildings, which loomed over the pathways, sometimes prevented rain from washing away the grime. For the poorest neighborhoods, cleanliness was an ongoing battle, one that was sometimes lost more often than won. However, that didn't mean the residents were resigned to squalor. Local communities would sometimes band together for cleaning days, where entire streets were swept. Refuse was gathered, and fresh water was poured down the gutters. These events weren't organized by the state, but rather by community leaders who understood that a cleaner street meant healthier families. A bit of civic pride, mixed with necessity, went a long way in keeping the worst of the filth at bay. One quirky tradition in these neighborhoods was the use of caged birds, canaries or sparrows, hung outside windows to detect bad air. It was believed that if the birds began to act strangely or stopped singing, it was a sign that the alley needed to be flushed with fresh water. While the science behind it was questionable, the practice persisted, a strange blend of superstition and early attempts at environmental awareness. Historians still argue whether these cleaning days were enough to make a significant impact. Some accounts describe the slums of Rome as perpetually filthy, the air heavy with the stench of waste and overcrowding. Others suggest that community pride and collective action kept many of the residential districts surprisingly tidy, even if only temporarily. What's clear is that the residents of the insulae didn't simply live in squalor, they fought back against it, broom by broom. The richer districts, of course, had their own methods. Wealthy residents would sometimes pay for additional street cleaning outside their properties, hiring scopari to make extra passes in the early morning hours. These hired sweepers would not only clear away debris, but also sprinkle the ground with water to keep the dust down. This wasn't just a matter of comfort. It was a statement of wealth. A clean path leading up to your villa showed that you had the means to control your environment, a symbol of power in a city where space and cleanliness were rare commodities. But whether rich or poor, the Romans shared a common understanding. A cleaner street was a safer street. Piles of trash weren't just unsightly. They were breeding grounds for rats and disease. Broken pottery shards could slice through sandals, and muddy alleys made for treacherous footing. It was in everyone's best interest to keep the streets passable. And despite the challenges, the residents of Rome's neighborhoods found ways to make it work. Imagine walking through one of these districts at dawn. You'd hear the scrape of brooms on stone, the trickle of water splashing down gutters, the occasional shout of "Garde l'eau" from an upper window. Merchants would be setting up their stalls, sweeping away the dust from their patches of stone. Children would run barefoot through the narrow lanes, dodging puddles and piles, their laughter echoing off brick walls. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Next, we'll leave the crowded streets of the insulae and step back into the open air, where Rome's public fountains and aqueduct-fed drinking spots flowed with fresh water, keeping the city both hydrated and just a little bit cleaner. As you step out from the tight-knit alleys of the insulae, the air feels fresher, crisper. The sounds of shouting merchants and clattering carts fade behind you, replaced by the gentle trickle and splash of water. You follow the sound, turning a corner, and there it is, one of Rome's many public fountains, water gushing freely from marble spouts into wide stone basins. The water sparkles in the sunlight, cool and clear, flowing steadily from distant hills right into the heart of the city. The Romans were masters of water engineering. Through their vast network of aqueducts, fresh water was carried from mountain springs across miles of countryside, crossing valleys and rivers. Supported by towering arches, these aqueducts fed not only the famous bathhouses and grand villas, but also the hundreds of public fountains scattered throughout Rome. These fountains weren't just decorative. They were lifelines for the city's residents. For the poorer citizens living in cramped insulae, the public fountains were their primary source of water. Each morning, families would arrive with clay jugs and wooden buckets, lining up to fill them with fresh water. Children would splash and play around the edges while their mothers chatted, waiting for their turn. It wasn't just a place to collect water, it was a gathering spot, a place where the news of the city was whispered, and daily gossip flowed as freely as the water itself. Historians still debate how many public fountains actually existed during Rome's peak. Some estimates suggest there were over 500 fountains spread across the city, ranging from simple spouts on street corners to grand marble structures adorned with statues and carvings. Others argue that the number was closer to 1,000, but either way, the scale was staggering. No other city in the world at that time boasted such access to fresh water. One of the grandest of these was the Fontana dell'Acqua Vergine, an ornate fountain that drew water directly from the Aqua Virgo, one of Rome's 11 aqueducts. Its water was so clean and so fresh that it was said even the wealthiest Romans would send their slaves to collect it, preferring its taste to the well water drawn from private estates. The fountain's name, meaning virgin water, was a nod to its purity, and its waters fed not only the public basins, but also the grand baths of Agrippa, just a short walk away. But the fountains weren't just places to drink and gather. They played a crucial role in keeping the city clean. Overflow channels were built into each fountain, directing excess water down the gutters and through the streets. This steady trickle of fresh water flushed away dirt and debris, keeping the cobblestones slick and mostly free of dust. On hot summer days, merchants would throw water from the fountains across the stone paths to settle the dust and cool the ground. It wasn't just practical. It was a small luxury in the sweltering heat of a Roman afternoon. The fountains also served another important function: fire prevention. With so many buildings constructed from wood and stone, fire was a constant threat. The public fountains, always flowing and always accessible, were a crucial defense against runaway flames. Buckets could be filled quickly, and the constant presence of water meant that fires could sometimes be contained before they spread too far. One particularly interesting practice involved the water carriers, known as equerri, who operated almost like a delivery service. These men would fill large clay jugs with water from the public fountains and haul them up the narrow staircases of insulae to families who couldn't make the trip themselves. For a small fee, they'd lug the heavy containers to the very top floors of apartment buildings, saving residents from the arduous climb. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential, and many of these water carriers became familiar faces in the neighborhoods they served. Historians still argue whether the equerrii operated officially under Roman regulation or if they were independent workers who simply carved out a niche in the city's bustling economy. Some records suggest that the city kept tabs on water distribution, ensuring that the fountains flowed freely and were not monopolized by private interests. Others hint that the equerri operated with a bit of freedom, negotiating their own fees and routes. Either way, their presence was a testament to Rome's ingenuity in managing its water. And then there were the public drinking spots, small stone basins set alongside busy market roads and intersections. These weren't as grand as the fountains, but were just as vital. Travelers and merchants could stop, cup their hands under the steady flow, and drink deeply before continuing on their way in the blazing heat of summer. These little drinking spots were a godsend, offering relief from the dust and sweat of the crowded streets. The Romans even had rules for who could drink when. On market days, vendors and merchants were given priority access to the fountains and drinking spots to fill their jugs and wash their wares. In the mornings, children and women were often seen first, gathering water for cooking and cleaning. By afternoon, laborers and builders would crowd around, washing the dust from their hands and faces, cooling off before heading back to work. It was a communal rhythm, a sort of unspoken understanding of who needed the water most at any given time. Imagine walking past one of these fountains in the early morning light. The water splashes against the stone, trickling down into the gutters, and carrying away the dust of the night. Merchants are setting up their stalls, their faces glistening with fresh water as they rinse their hands and splash their necks. Children chase each other around the edges of the basins, laughing and shouting as their mothers fill clay jugs. It's a scene of everyday life, but it's also a testament to Roman ingenuity. Because for Rome, water wasn't just a convenience, it was civilization itself. The aqueducts that fed these fountains weren't just engineering marvels. They were lifelines, ensuring that Rome stayed hydrated, its streets stayed clean, and its people stayed connected. Next, we'll move away from the splashing fountains and explore how Rome managed its food markets and waste disposal. For a city that traded in everything from salted fish to exotic spices, keeping the marketplaces clean and navigable was no small task, and the methods they used, surprisingly effective, and occasionally a bit strange. The sounds of haggling merchants and the sharp calls of vendors fade as you follow the creaking carts trundling away from Rome's bustling markets. The cobbled streets grow quieter, the buildings less grand, and the air thicker with the scent of dust and ash. You're heading toward the hidden backbone of Rome's waste management, the dumping grounds and recycling yards where the city's refuse found a second life. Unlike the bustling markets and public fountains, these areas were unremarkable to the casual observer. Muddy lots on the edge of the city, dotted with piles of broken pottery, splintered wood, and heaps of discarded metal. But for those who worked here, it was a place of transformation. Rome's waste didn't just disappear. It was sorted, repurposed, and sold back into the economy in ways that were both clever and efficient. The process began with the stercorarii, the waste collectors who gathered debris from the markets, insulae, and public spaces. Their wooden carts, piled high with refuse, would roll through the city's narrow streets at dawn, collecting whatever had been left behind. The stercorarii worked tirelessly, hauling their loads out to designated dumping sites, where the real work began. Upon arrival, the piles of waste were not simply discarded. They were sorted by material: metal, glass, pottery, and wood were carefully separated and piled into distinct sections. This was a far cry from the haphazard disposal you might expect from an ancient civilization. In fact, the organization was quite methodical. Metal scraps were pulled from heaps of trash and sold to local blacksmiths for melting and reforging. Broken glassware was collected by glass blowers who would remelt it, shaping it into new containers or decorative items. Even the smallest shards had value, often ground down and used as filler in construction. Pottery was perhaps the most ingeniously reused. When amphorae, those large clay vessels that carried olive oil and wine, cracked or shattered, their fragments were collected and ground into a fine powder. This powder was mixed with lime to create pozzolana cement, the same sturdy material used in the construction of aqueducts and public buildings. Nothing was wasted if it could serve another purpose. Roman engineers even learned to use this ceramic dust to strengthen roadways, mixing it into the mortar that held their famous cobblestones together. Historians still debate whether this system was a product of state organization or simply the ingenuity of private entrepreneurs. Some suggest that the Roman government oversaw much of the recycling process, ensuring that waste was efficiently collected and repurposed. Others believe that independent tradesmen, opportunistic and resourceful, took it upon themselves to mine the city's waste for valuable materials. In truth, it was likely a mix of both. Public infrastructure met with private enterprise, each benefiting from the other's necessity. One particularly interesting part of this system was the bone and horn trade. Rome's markets saw thousands of animals slaughtered each year for meat, and their bones and horns didn't go to waste. Workshops specializing in bone carving dotted the industrial sections of the city, transforming these remnants into buttons, combs, needles, and even game pieces. Horn, once softened by boiling, was shaped into drinking vessels, handles, and decorative inlays for furniture. It was a bustling trade, one that thrived on what others considered refuse. The same resourcefulness applied to wood and leather. Discarded crates and broken cartwheels were hauled to carpenters who would strip them down, salvaging any good planks for furniture or building repairs. Leather scraps, often collected from markets or workshops, were stitched together to create new sandals or tool pouches. Even small pieces of hide were used to reinforce straps or patch worn garments. One particularly odd practice involved ash and soot. The Romans, ever practical, found that the ash from bakeries and forges could be mixed with sand and lime to create a rudimentary form of plaster. This material was often used to patch up walls and reinforce floors in poorer neighborhoods. It wasn't beautiful, but it worked, and it kept the insulae standing strong, even under the weight of crowded families and heavy foot traffic. Historians still argue over the extent of Rome's recycling system. Some claim that it was primarily a matter of survival. When resources are expensive, you make the most of what you have. Others believe that there was a deeper philosophy at work, a Roman instinct for order and efficiency that extended even to their garbage, regardless of the motivation. The result was clear. Very little went to waste in the Eternal City. The recycling yards also had a kind of secondary economy. Merchants would buy salvaged materials at a fraction of their original cost, refashion them into usable goods, and sell them back at the markets. A broken amphora could become part of a building's foundation. Shattered glass could be reblown into bottles. Even discarded cloth found its way back into the marketplace, patched together into makeshift clothing or blankets for the poor. It was a quiet economy, humming away beneath the grandeur of Rome's public life, yet crucial to its survival. Imagine walking through one of these recycling yards at dawn. The morning mist clings to the piles of pottery shards, dew sparkling on broken amphorae like drops of molten gold. Workers pick through the debris with practiced hands, sorting iron nails from splintered wood, scooping ash into barrels, and tossing broken glass into crates bound for the glass blowers' kilns. The air is thick with the smell of dust and earth. But there's something else there too, a sense of purpose, of transformation. Rome wasn't just a city of grand temples and marble statues. It was a living, breathing organism that found value even in its own waste. The idea that nothing was truly useless, that every scrap had potential, was woven into the fabric of the city. It was how Rome thrived, century after century, turning broken remnants into the foundation of something new. Next, we'll journey back toward the crowded streets and explore how public sanitation laws and fines helped keep Rome's sprawling metropolis mostly clean and orderly, a delicate balance of civic pride and strict regulation. As you leave behind the dust and clatter of Rome's recycling yards, the streets widen and the familiar hum of city life swells around you. Carts trundle by, their wooden wheels clattering over cobblestones. Market vendors shout their prices, waving fresh bread and ripe olives in the air. But even amid all this chaos, there's an unmistakable sense of order. Streets mostly clear of debris, markets tidily arranged, and fountains sparkling with fresh water. This wasn't just by chance. Rome, for all its sprawling complexity, was kept clean and orderly by a series of public sanitation laws and fines. The Romans understood that a clean city wasn't just pleasant, it was necessary for public health and civic pride. To ensure this standard, they enforced a series of regulations known as the Lex Julia Municipalis. This ancient law code set forth rules for the maintenance of public spaces, street cleaning, and waste disposal. Shop owners were required to keep the stretch of road in front of their businesses clear of trash. Homeowners were responsible for sweeping the sidewalks outside their residences. Even the grand temples and public squares had designated caretakers who scrubbed their marble steps and swept away the dust that settled daily. The consequences of ignoring these responsibilities weren't just social, they were financial. Rome's aediles, the city officials responsible for maintenance and public order, patrolled the streets with sharp eyes, looking for violations. If you were caught with refuse piling up outside your shop or animal waste left unattended, you could be fined on the spot. These fines weren't minor inconveniences. they could be steep enough to sting, particularly for market vendors and smaller shopkeepers. Historians still debate how rigorously these laws were enforced across all of Rome. Some accounts describe the wealthy districts near the Forum and Palatine Hill as sparklingly clean, patrolled regularly by the aediles. The poorer districts, however, weren't always as fortunate. With narrow alleys and towering insulae, waste collection was more chaotic, and enforcement was sometimes inconsistent. Even so, the mere threat of a fine kept most citizens in line. For merchants, especially those operating in the busy markets of the Forum Holatorium or the Forum Boarium, the pressure was even greater. These bustling hubs were the lifeblood of commerce, and filth could mean losing customers. To stay competitive, vendors would often pay scoparii, Rome's street sweepers, to make extra passes near their stalls, brushing away dirt and litter before the market crowds arrived. It wasn't just about avoiding fines. It was good business. A clean stall drew more buyers, and more buyers meant more coin. One particularly clever practice involved waste tokens. Some neighborhoods organized a system where homeowners would pay a small fee each month in exchange for tokens. These tokens could be handed to local waste collectors, who would then prioritize picking up refuse from homes that participated in the program. It was a simple but effective system that ensured regular waste collection for those who contributed. For the poorer districts, this often meant pooling resources as a community to guarantee cleaner streets. The Romans also made use of public shaming as a tool for cleanliness. If a property owner neglected to maintain their stretch of road, neighbors could report the issue to the aediles. If the complaint was valid, a wooden placard would be placed outside the property, marking it as unclean. For a city so deeply rooted in civic pride, this was often enough to spur action. No one wanted to be publicly branded as a poor neighbor, especially in communities where reputations mattered. But it wasn't just individual citizens who faced scrutiny. Entire guilds and associations were responsible for keeping their sections of the city tidy. Bakers would sweep up flour and ash from their ovens. Iron workers would clear away metal shavings, and fishmongers would wash away scales and offal from their stalls. The expectation was clear. If you profited from Rome's streets, you helped maintain them. Historians still argue whether these guilds were strictly regulated or if their collective cleanup efforts were more voluntary. Some records suggest that aediles made regular inspections, doling out fines to those who failed to keep their areas clean. Others believe that the competitive nature of the markets kept most vendors diligent. After all, a cleaner stall attracted more business, and in Rome, commerce was survival. And when fines weren't enough, the Romans turned to community service. In some instances, those unable to pay their fines for neglecting public cleanliness were ordered to assist the scopari in sweeping the streets or clearing public spaces. It was a clever system, punishment that doubled as public service, reinforcing the idea that everyone had a role to play in keeping the city clean. One peculiar bit of Roman ingenuity involved the fountains and public wash basins. In particularly busy districts, overflow channels were designed to direct water down the main roads, flushing away the dust and debris of the day. During festival days, special crews would open additional sluice gates, sending waves of water down the Forum and other main avenues, scrubbing the stones clean. It wasn't just effective, it was theatrical. Crowds would gather to watch the streets gleam anew, a visual reminder of Rome's strength and order. Imagine standing in the Forum as the midday sun casts shadows across marble pillars. You'd hear the rhythmic sweep of brooms, the splash of water as merchants rinse down their stalls, and the steady march of aediles, their eyes sharp for any sign of neglect. It was more than cleanliness. It was civic pride, a public declaration that Rome was orderly, grand, and unstoppable. And it wasn't just the Forum. These regulations extended out to the port districts and even the crowded slums of the Subura. Wherever there were people, there were expectations for cleanliness, and Rome wasn't afraid to enforce them. It's hard to imagine now, but for a city of nearly 1 million people, The idea that everyone took part in keeping the streets clean was revolutionary, and it worked. Next, we'll leave the crowded markets and regulation-heavy streets and explore how festivals and parades changed the face of the city, where cleanliness was elevated to spectacle, and the streets of Rome became stages for grandeur and civic pride. The sun rises high over Rome, casting long shadows from the towering columns and marble statues that line the streets. There's a certain energy in the air, a crackling sense of anticipation that pulses through the crowded avenues. Today isn't just any day, it's a festival day, and the city is transforming before your eyes. Banners ripple from the windows, vendors shout louder, and the streets, normally bustling with everyday life, are swept clean and polished to perfection. Rome. On days like this, shines, festivals were more than mere celebrations. They were spectacles of Roman pride and power. From the raucous chaos of Saturnalia to the military grandeur of triumphs, these public events weren't just for show. They were demonstrations of the city's might and order. And a key part of that display, impeccable cleanliness. The city's aediles would begin preparations days in advance, dispatching scopari to sweep every inch of the parade routes. Dust and debris were brushed aside, stones were scrubbed, and even the fountains were polished until their marble faces gleamed in the sunlight. Historians still debate just how extensive these cleanups truly were. Some accounts describe the streets as practically sparkling on festival days, while others suggest that the main routes were pristine, but the back alleys remained as cluttered as ever. What's certain is that for the main events, the city put its best foot forward. Pathways leading to the Forum Romanum, the Circus Maximus, and the Via Sacra were swept not just once, but multiple times throughout the day to ensure they remained spotless for the processions. But it wasn't just about appearances. Clean streets had a practical purpose. Too, during grand parades, like a Roman triumph, the city would overflow with spectators, packed shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the victorious general and his spoils of war. The roads needed to be clear, not just for the soldiers marching in formation, but for the chariots, war horses, and wagons loaded with treasures. Any stray debris could mean disaster for the delicate wheels of a carriage, or the hooves of a prized stallion. One of the most spectacular displays of civic pride was the scattering of flower petals along the parade routes. Early in the morning, before the crowds gathered, workers would move through the streets, tossing petals across the stones. Roses, laurel leaves, and even violets were spread thickly enough to cushion the footsteps of the marching soldiers. It wasn't just beautiful, it was symbolic. A carpet of flowers signified peace and prosperity, a gentle layer of softness laid down for the conquering heroes of Rome. To keep this grand spectacle from becoming a chaotic mess, the idols enforced strict rules. Vendors were forbidden from setting up stalls too close to the main roads during the processions. Anyone caught tossing refuse or dirtying the path was fined on the spot. Guards patrolled the edges, ensuring the pathways remained clear and the flower petals undisturbed until the procession had passed. It was a form of order that mirrored Rome's military precision, a march of cleanliness that accompanied the March of Legions. Historians still argue whether the use of flower petals was purely symbolic, or if it also served a practical purpose. Some believe that the petals helped reduce dust, cushioning the stones and keeping the air clearer for the thousands of spectators. Others suggest it was simply an extravagance, a way to show off Rome's wealth and abundance. Either way, the effect was stunning. Streets that might normally be gritty and bustling were transformed into pathways of color and fragrance, a sensory reminder of Rome's power and prosperity. Of course, not all festivals were as grand as a triumph. During the Lupercalia, an ancient Roman fertility festival, the streets would be swept clean to make way for the Luperci. Young men clad in nothing but goat skins, running through the streets and playfully striking onlookers with strips of leather. It was believed that this ritual encouraged fertility and good health, and the city made sure the pathways were clear to avoid tripping or injury. After all, it wouldn't do for a sacred rite to be interrupted by a stray pile of vegetable peels or a patch of mud. The preparations for these festivals weren't just left to the scoparii and aediles. Citizens were expected to do their part. 2. Shop owners swept their storefronts, homeowners washed their steps, and even street vendors polished their stalls. It was a collective effort, a demonstration that the greatness of Rome wasn't just found in its emperors and senators. It lived in the hands of its everyday people. One particularly interesting practice during these events involved the water carriers, or aquarii. On the morning of a major festival, water would be drawn from public fountains and splashed over the streets to keep the dust down. This wasn't a light sprinkling, but a thorough dousing, enough to settle the dust and make the stones glisten. It added to the sense of occasion, as if the entire city had been polished just for the celebration. After the processions and parades had ended, a different sort of cleanup began. Workers moved through the streets, sweeping up flower petals, gathering stray bits of trash, and scrubbing away any remnants of the festivities. It was a cycle. Clean, celebrate, clean again. For Rome, maintaining order was just as important as demonstrating it. Imagine standing on the edge of the Via Sacra as a triumph passes by. The stones beneath your feet are clean and polished, a carpet of fresh petals cushioning each step. The scent of roses lingers in the air, mingling with the sweet tang of incense burning along the path. Soldiers march by in perfect formation, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. While children toss laurel branches onto the path ahead of them, the city feels alive, pristine, a living testament to its greatness. But after the flowers have wilted and the crowds have dispersed, Rome would return to its everyday rhythm. The markets would reopen, the scoparii would resume their sweeping, and life would carry on as it always did. Yet the memory of the clean, polished streets, the petals scattered like confetti, lingered in the minds of the people. A reminder of what Rome could be at its finest. Next, we'll move away from the flower-strewn pathways and into the grimy but vital world of tanneries and dye houses, where the air was thick with the scent of leather and boiling vats, and cleanliness was a constant struggle against the byproducts of industry. As the echoes of festival cheers and flower-strewn streets fade behind you, the air begins to change. It grows heavier, thick with the pungent scent of boiling vats and rawhide. You've wandered into one of Rome's most essential, but least glamorous, districts, the tanneries and dye houses. Here, cleanliness wasn't a matter of civic pride or religious ritual. It was a constant struggle against the gritty reality of manufacturing. The Romans were skilled leather workers, and their tanneries were vital to the city's economy. Shoes, belts, saddles, armor, and even bookbindings depended on strong, durable leather. The process, however, was anything but clean. Tanning hides required a meticulous and messy series of steps: soaking, scraping, salting, and finally treating the leather with agents that would make a modern nose wrinkle in disgust. Historians still debate the exact methods used, but most agree that the basic process involved soaking hides in large vats of water to loosen the hair. This wasn't just clean water, though. Often, it was mixed with urine and animal dung. The ammonia found in urine acted as a natural agent to soften the hides, while the enzymes in dung helped to break down the remaining hair and tissue. The result, piles of stripped hides ready for the next step, and a stench that clung to the air for blocks. The workers, tanners known as corrierae, toiled in these conditions day in and day out. Their hands were calloused from scraping hides with iron blades, their clothes stained from the constant contact with brine and ash. The streets outside the tanneries were no less grimy. Runoff from the vats often spilled out onto the cobblestones, leaving slick trails of dark water. To combat the buildup of waste, the city employed special scoparii, whose sole task was to sweep and flush the streets near the tanneries. But keeping these streets clean was no easy task. The water used to rinse the hides, carried away bits of flesh and hair, staining the stones and clogging the gutters. On rainy days, the mix of mud and runoff could transform the roads into thick, soupy paths that were nearly impossible to navigate without slipping. It wasn't uncommon for merchants and pedestrians to avoid the tannery district entirely after a storm, knowing that the streets would be slick with grime and the smell would be even more pungent. One interesting solution involved the use of sawdust. Local carpenters would sell their sawdust to the tannery workers, who would sprinkle it over the wet stone paths. The sawdust soaked up the slick residue, making it easier to sweep away and keeping the roads somewhat navigable. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the worst of the muck in check. For Rome, that was often enough. The dye houses, located just beyond the tanneries, were no less messy. Here, vats of boiling water bubbled with vibrant colors: reds, blues, purples, each extracted from minerals, plants, or even insects. The most prized dye of all was Tyrian purple, harvested from thousands of tiny sea snails. It took about 12,000 snails to produce just a gram of dye, and the process was as foul-smelling as it was labor-intensive. The dye houses reeked of brine and sulfur, their vats sending up clouds of steam that carried the acrid scent for blocks. The streets around the dye houses faced their own sanitation issues. The runoff from dyeing vats often spilled into the gutters, staining the stones with streaks of color. Some historians believe that these splashes of red and blue became so commonplace that locals barely noticed them, while others argue that the stains served almost as advertisements for the dye workers, a reminder of the vibrant fabrics that emerged from those steamy workshops. Keeping these streets clean was a monumental task, and it fell to the aediles to ensure that the waste from tanneries and dye houses didn't spill over into the more populated parts of the city. Wastewater was supposed to be funneled into special drainage channels that led to the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's massive sewer system. But blockages weren't uncommon, and when they happened, the mess would back up into the streets, creating puddles of murky, foul-smelling water that clung to the soles of sandals and left streaks of color wherever it went. Historians still argue over how effective these drainage systems really were. Some claim that the sewers were well maintained and capable of handling the runoff from Rome's industries. Others believe that the sheer volume of waste often overwhelmed the system, leading to regular overflows and street flooding. Evidence of both exists. There are records of well-functioning drainage, but also accounts of streets ankle-deep in refuse after heavy rains. One peculiar part of the tannery district was the presence of pigeon coops. For reasons still debated, pigeons were kept near some of the leather workshops. Some historians suggest that pigeon droppings, rich in ammonia, were collected and added to the tanning vats to aid in the curing process. Others believe the birds simply thrived on the scraps left behind by workers: bits of grain, discarded bread, and the occasional insect that wandered too close. Whatever the reason, the coops were a familiar sight, their occupants fluttering between rooftops and stone ledges, adding yet another layer of grime to the narrow alleyways. Despite the mess, the tannery and dye house districts were vital to Rome's economy. Leather and dyed fabrics were sold across the empire, prized for their quality and durability. For many Romans, the smell of boiling leather or simmering dye wasn't unpleasant. It was the scent of industry, of commerce, of Rome's power stretching across the known world. Imagine walking through this part of the city, the air thick with steam, and the ground stained with splashes of color. Workers hunch over vats, stirring with long wooden paddles, their hands stained crimson or indigo. Carts trundle by, piled high with fresh hides or bundles of dyed cloth, their wheels leaving streaks of muddy water in their wake. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. These were the engines of Rome's economy, the hands that clothed the legions and outfitted the merchants who traveled far and wide. Next, we'll step away from the smoky air of the tannery district and explore the nighttime sweepers and after-dark sanitation. The unseen workforce that kept Rome livable when the sun went down and the crowds faded away. As the sun dips below the skyline of Rome, casting long shadows across marble columns and cobblestone streets, the city doesn't fall silent. Not entirely, though the merchants shutter their stalls and the clatter of carts fades away. Another kind of life stirs in the twilight. This is when the nighttime sweepers and after-dark sanitation crews emerge, their work hidden from the bustling daytime crowds, yet crucial to the city's survival. By day, Rome was a spectacle of noise and chaos, a place of market stalls, political speeches, and crowded streets. But by night, it belonged to the nocturnal workers. These crews were made up of scoparia, stercorari, and water carriers who took advantage of the quieter hours to perform the heavier tasks of cleaning that would be impossible during the rush of daylight. With fewer people in the way, they could move freely, dragging their brooms across cobbled pathways and sweeping piles of trash into waiting carts. The nighttime sweepers focused particularly on the main avenues and market streets, places like the Via Sacra, which during the day was packed with merchants and travelers, were swept clean of the day's debris, bits of fruit peel, broken pottery, and even the odd sandal left behind in the rush. It wasn't just about appearances. A clean street meant fewer hazards when the morning traffic resumed. One of the more fascinating aspects of after-dark sanitation was the use of water flushing. Rome's aqueducts ran day and night, and public fountains overflowed into channels that spilled into the streets. At night, workers would unblock special sluice gates, allowing water to flood the stone pathways, washing away the dust and grime of the day. This wasn't a light trickle. It was a deliberate flush designed to clear the gutters and refresh the main roads. By dawn, the stones gleamed, washed clean by the very water that had traveled miles from distant springs. Historians still debate how coordinated these efforts truly were. Some suggest that Rome's aediles orchestrated the nightly cleanings with military precision, dispatching scoparii to specific sectors and timing the water flushes to maximize efficiency. Others believe it was more haphazard, with individual neighborhoods hiring their own crews to handle the task. Regardless, the result was clear. Each morning, Rome awoke to streets that were, if not pristine, at least navigable. The stercorari, or waste collectors, had perhaps the most unenviable job. At night, they would rumble through the darkened streets with their heavy carts, collecting refuse from communal bins and public dumping spots. Their paths often led to the outskirts of the city, where the waste would be piled onto Rome's growing landfills, or, in some cases, sifted through for anything of value. In this way, Rome's trash collectors weren't just sweepers. They were scavengers of opportunity. Broken pottery could be ground into construction filler, glass shards could be remelted, and even discarded iron nails might find new life in a blacksmith's hands. One particularly unusual task fell to the night rakers, who worked in tandem with the stercorari. Their job was to rake the streets for animal waste, fallen hay, and discarded food scraps. This was especially important near the Forum Boarium, where cattle were regularly traded and butchered. The night rakers would shovel up the refuse, piling it onto carts bound for the compost heaps outside the city. Farmers from the surrounding countryside would purchase the waste, knowing it would enrich their fields. It wasn't glamorous, but it was part of Rome's vast, interconnected system of cleanliness and reuse. Historians still argue whether these nighttime cleanups were truly effective or more symbolic. Some accounts praise the cleanliness of Rome's main avenues, attributing it to the tireless work of the night crews. Others suggest that while the main roads were maintained, the back alleys and poorer districts saw little of this nocturnal care. In places like the Subura, where the insulae stood tall and tightly packed, night sweepers were a rare sight. There, the streets were left to their own devices, and waste often piled up until daylight scoparii made their rounds. But in the grand avenues and near the palaces of the elite, the streets gleamed in the morning light. evidence of the work done while the city slept. Night sweepers even found time to polish statues and public monuments. Marble figures of emperors and gods were brushed free of dust, and the bronze statues that dotted the forum were wiped clean of grime. It was said that the night workers took special pride in this task, polishing the symbols of Rome's greatness under the cover of darkness, so that by dawn they would gleam for the city to admire. One peculiar tradition was the practice of lantern sweeping. Because the streets were dimly lit by oil lamps and occasional torches, night sweepers carried their own lights. Small lanterns, shielded from the wind by iron frames, cast soft glows over the stone paths. This created a surreal scene, lines of scoparie moving methodically, their lanterns bobbing in the dark like fireflies, sweeping and brushing away the remnants of the day. The soft glow was sometimes the only light that shone on certain parts of the city, a testament to the quiet work that kept Rome running. Imagine standing in a shadowed alleyway at midnight, the city mostly still, save for the distant murmur of sweepers at work. The lanterns flicker, casting long shadows that dance across the stone. The scoparii move silently, their brooms brushing over cobblestones with rhythmic precision. Behind them, the stercorarii load their carts with refuse, the wooden wheels creaking as they roll down the empty paths. The city sleeps, but its heartbeat continues, steady and unyielding. And when the sun finally rises, the streets are clean, the market paths clear, and the statues polished as if by magic. Few Romans ever saw the sweepers at work, but their absence was proof enough. A clean street was their signature, a testament to the unseen hands that kept Rome beautiful even as it slept. Next, we'll step away from the shadows of the night and into the sprawling grandeur of Rome's imperial palaces and their private sanitation systems, a world of luxury, marble, and engineering marvels where cleanliness wasn't just a duty. It was an art form. As the first light of dawn spills over the towering arches and grand avenues of Rome, the city stirs back to life. But today, you're not wandering through the bustling markets or squeezing down narrow alleys. Instead, you follow the polished stone pathways that lead up the Palatine Hill, the most prestigious address in Rome. Here, the marble walls gleam with sunlight. Manicured gardens stretch out in perfect symmetry, and fountains bubble with fresh water from the aqueducts. This is the realm of the imperial palaces, where cleanliness wasn't just a necessity, it was an expression of power and luxury. The palaces of Rome were sprawling complexes, more like small cities than mere homes. Emperor Augustus's residence, for example, was a marvel of architecture, decorated with intricate mosaics, towering columns, and sprawling gardens. But as grand as these spaces were, they still generated waste. Food scraps from lavish feasts, ashes from countless braziers, and the general detritus of daily life had to be dealt with. And the solution, a sophisticated and highly organized system of private sanitation. While the common people relied on public latrines and shared sewers, the imperial palaces had their own private sewage systems, directly connected to the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's colossal underground sewer. These private channels were carved from stone, their walls polished to prevent blockages. Waste from the kitchens, baths, and latrines flowed smoothly through these hidden passages, carried by gravity and the constant trickle of water supplied by Rome's aqueducts. The design was so effective that historians still marvel at its ingenuity. Historians still debate the extent of imperial influence over these sanitation marvels. Some believe that the emperor's engineers oversaw the construction and maintenance of these private systems with military precision. Others suggest that wealthy families hired their own teams of workers to keep the pipes clear and the pathways clean. In either case, the results were impressive. The palaces remained pristine, their marble floors unblemished by the grime that accumulated in the streets below. One particularly clever innovation was the use of siphon systems to prevent odors from rising back up into the palaces. These were essentially water traps, curves in the pipes that held standing water, creating a barrier that blocked the foul smells from traveling back through the drains. It's a design that still exists in modern modern plumbing today, a testament to Roman ingenuity, and the grandeur didn't stop at waste management. The imperial palaces also featured elaborate bathing complexes that rivaled even the grand public baths of Caracalla or Diocletian. These private bathhouses were fed by dedicated channels from the city's aqueducts, filling their pools with fresh water that was heated by underground furnaces. Marble-lined pools glistened with clear water, and mosaics of dolphins and sea nymphs sparkled beneath the surface. Even here, sanitation was paramount. Workers cleaned the pools daily, scrubbing the marble floors and draining the water before refilling it with fresh supplies. The emperor's private gardens, too, were kept immaculately clean. Servants would sweep the pathways every morning, brushing away fallen leaves and stray petals. The fountains that dotted the landscape were polished regularly, and the hedges trimmed with almost military precision. The palace grounds weren't just a place to stroll. They were a symbol of imperial control, order in nature, perfection in stone. But it wasn't just the emperor who benefited from such luxury. High-ranking officials and senators living on the Palatine also had access to private sanitation. Their villas boasted private latrines, small but efficient, and many had indoor plumbing that rivaled even modern standards. Fresh water poured from bronze spigots, and waste flowed directly into underground pipes that carried it far away from the marble courtyards and mosaic-tiled floors. It was luxury defined, not just in aesthetics, but in practical comfort. Historians still argue about just how widespread this luxury was. Some claim that only the wealthiest of Rome's elite had access to such amenities, while others suggest that private latrines and personal waste channels were more common than previously thought. Archaeological digs have uncovered remnants of indoor plumbing in villas far from the Palatine, suggesting that Rome's obsession with cleanliness extended beyond the imperial family. One of the more fascinating aspects of the palace's private sanitation was the presence of hidden waste chutes. In some parts of the residences, small hatches were built into the walls, disguised by ornate carvings or wooden panels. Servants could discreetly toss waste into these chutes, where it would slide down into collection bins that were emptied nightly by the palace's own crew of stercorarii. It was a seamless system, clean, hidden, and efficient. Even the imperial kitchens operated with a level of sanitation that would surprise many today. Stone countertops were scrubbed after every meal, and leftover food scraps were swept into specially designed drains that carried them out of sight. The floors were often lined with smooth stone to prevent dirt from gathering in cracks, making them easier to clean. Fires were doused with water each evening to prevent ash from lingering, and servants polished the brass and bronze cooking tools until they shone. Imagine standing in the courtyard of Emperor Augustus's palace at dawn. The fountains burble softly, their waters clear and bright. Servants move silently along the stone pathways, brushing away stray leaves and rinsing the marble steps. The air is crisp, scented with the faint hint of lavender from the palace gardens. Beneath your feet, hidden from sight, the waste of the imperial household flows silently away, carried by channels that hum with efficiency. For Rome's elite, cleanliness was more than comfort. It was a declaration of power and control. To live above the grime of the city, to walk marble paths unblemished by dirt or debris, was to show the world that you stood above it all, untouched by the messiness of daily life. But as the light fades and the lanterns flicker to life, the grand palaces close their gates, their gleaming walls hidden behind towering arches, and you're left with the thought of what lay beneath it all. The sewers, the drains, the night workers who kept it all moving. Rome was more than just marble and grandeur. It was a living, breathing machine, powered by sweat, engineering, and the constant fight against filth. Now, it's time to gently leave the bustling streets and towering palaces of Rome behind. Let the images fade. The gleaming marble paths, the rushing water of aqueducts, the whisper of brooms sweeping stone. Close your eyes and imagine the city growing still, its streets empty, its lights flickering out. one by one. Rome rests, clean and orderly, just as its citizens and its emperors intended. Now, as the lights fade across the grand avenues, and the last whispers of market chatter drift into silence, Rome settles into its midnight calm. The marble paths, scrubbed and polished by unseen hands, gleam softly under the moonlight. Fountains murmur in the darkness, their waters still flowing, still pure, just as they did during the height of the empire. It's easy to imagine the scoparii sweeping quietly through the alleys, their brooms brushing rhythmically over cobblestones, the soft scrape echoing through empty streets. Beneath the city, the Cloaca Maxima hums with its eternal current, carrying away the remnants of 1,000,000 lives. Bits of pottery, dust from the Forum, petals scattered during triumphs. The sewers run silently, their stone arches unyielding, just as they have for centuries. It's a river of memory, sweeping away the debris of everyday life so that Rome may wake, polished and proud, with each dawn. In the palaces on the Palatine, marble halls sleep beneath silken drapes. The water in the fountains trickles on, untouched, waiting for the first light of morning to catch its surface and make it sparkle again. Even the bustling markets are still now, their pathways cleared, their stalls empty, only the faint scent of bread and olive oil lingering in the air. Let your mind drift back through those pathways, past the grand arches, along the polished stones, and through the whispering fountains. Picture the streets clean and quiet, the city at rest. Breathe deeply, let the images fade softly, like petals swept away by the evening wind. Rome rests now, as do you, carried away by the rhythm of its eternal hum.